Pregnancy, the joy of bringing another human being into this world. It's a time of excitement for many expecting mothers, but what they don't expect is for that pregnancy to be cut short, never making it to the delivery room because of an evil plan to destroy an entire family and steal their baby from their womb. This is what is known as a fetal abduction, and sadly, that is what we're talking about in today's case. Deadly Deep Dives. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kimberlea. If you've never been here before, nice to finally meet you. I have been saying that this case has been extremely difficult for me to do. I even took a week off. I had a lot going on, holidays. I'm sure all of you can relate to that part. But I know this case may be very triggering to many people, especially if you are an expectant mother. It's one of the most gruesome and cruel cases that I've researched to date. And I'm warning you now that it made me physically ill thinking about the details. But on the other hand, I definitely want to bring awareness to this case, which I was actually surprised hadn't been talked about as much as I thought it would, considering how unbelievable it really is. I'm also going to give you some warnings because there are signs to look for as a pregnant woman so that you don't fall into the trap of these criminals that have been called womb raiders. Because sadly, expecting mothers are targeted, just like the woman that I'm going to be introducing you to today. But before we get into it, I want to give a big thanks to our sponsor for today's video, and that is MyHeritage. And I've worked with them before, and I had so much fun discovering their family history and DNA service that I decided to gift it to my daughter, and now I am gifting it to John this holiday season. And I was so curious what we would find out about him. I know so many people ask what his ethnicity is. Do you have any guesses? Well, you can leave them below, but you won't have to wait much longer because we are going to be revealing it in just a moment. MyHeritage covers more regions than any other test, so I'm excited to find out. Guess what?
What is that?
You have to open it and find out.
Okay. I love presents. Ooh, what is it? Oh, cool.
Okay, we're gonna get started, and while he's doing this, I will show you what's in the kit and how easy it is to do. It only takes 2 minutes. There's a step-by-step, and all you do is swab the inside of each cheek for 30 seconds, and then you're going to stick it into this vial, and there's 2 of them, so you're gonna do it twice. And then we are going to stick them inside this plastic bag. And then you're going to stick the plastic bag into the envelope and you're going to mail the vials. The lab will get it and then you will get your results within 3 or 4 weeks. But you won't have to wait that long because we're going to cut to him getting his results so you can see what they are. Something I like to do while I'm waiting for my results is take advantage of their cool photo features to enhance, colorize, and animate old pictures of my family. Or you can build out your family tree. I love how easy it is to locate new relatives. It's exciting too, because you never know what you're gonna learn when you log on and explore your family history. I also like how you can toggle between the different DNA kits that you've purchased and analyzed for your family members. You can see me here, my daughter, and now John. Another important aspect of MyHeritage is their commitment to users' privacy. They never sell or license your genetic DNA. You are the sole owner of your DNA data, and that makes me feel secure using their service. Okay, now let's fast forward to John getting his results. Before we check the results, what do you think you are?
Well, growing up, I always thought I was Italian, Dutch, Native American, and Portuguese. That's what I've been told, and that's what I'm believing.
I was told that I was Italian and Lithuanian, and that is exactly what showed up in my results. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready.
And they are going to be seeing what is on your screen right now.
Here we go. I am... There you go. 32. Italian. Uh-huh. What else we got? Or 27% okay, I didn't know that.
Mesoamerican
and Andean. Andean.
Iberian.
16.8% Iberian.
Interesting.
Okay. 11.3% Scandinavian.
And then he's got
quite a bit more.
That's so cool. I love it. Yeah. Are you excited? Is there anything you didn't know?
I didn't know I was Iberian.
Interesting.
Or Mesoamerican. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I had fun.
Yeah, I did too.
I think it's a fun gift.
Thanks, baby.
You're welcome. I love you.
I love you, baby.
MyHeritage has a promotion right now, so click the link in my description box and use the coupon code for free shipping so that you can buy a DNA kit for yourself or gift one to a family member or friend. And thanks again for MyHeritage for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into the case for today. I want to introduce you to Debra Jo Evans, who is known as Debbie. She was born on May 6, 1967. Debbie grew up in a religious family with her mother Jacqueline and father Sam Evans Sr. in Chicago, Illinois, where she was the oldest of 4 children. She had 2 younger sisters, Wendy and Katie, and a younger brother, Sam Jr. Debbie excelled in her studies, and she was described as boisterous and fun, and would have a habit of visibly biting her lip when she was acting a little mischievous. But as she grew up, Debbie struggled with low self-esteem. Even though she tried her best to keep her spirits high, it all started with the divorce of her parents. Her friends thought it was probably the beginning of Debbie's struggle to feel loved and accepted. Oftentimes, she would get involved with men who didn't treat her very well. And according to her family, things took a turn after a teenage pregnancy. She started hanging out with the wrong crowd. Debbie got pregnant at the age of 18, and of course, her mother, Jackie, a devout Baptist, she didn't believe that having children out of wedlock was the right thing to do, and she did not condone it. But Jackie stayed close to Debbie. However, as much as Debbie talked and shared things with her mother, she was closed off when discussing details about her relationships with men, knowing her mom would not approve. On September 29, 1985, 18-year-old Debbie gave birth to her first child, a daughter that she named Samantha Jean Evans, after her dad, Sam. She looked just like her mama, with light hair and big blue eyes. Debbie didn't stay with Samantha's father, Scott Gilbert, who eventually moved to Florida. She raised little Samantha all on her own. Debbie's friend said she continued to struggle with self-esteem issues and had a very hard time dealing with unwanted weight gain. So she had the habit of turning to men who would show interest in her and who made her feel wanted, even if that meant these men didn't have the best reputation. Her friends actually described Debbie as on an unfulfilled quest for happiness, and that makes me sad. I think we're all on a quest to be happy, and that's what Debbie wanted. 3 years after having her daughter Samantha, Debbie welcomed her son, Joshua Ryan Evans, into the world on March 21st, 1988. And just like his sister and his mama, he had blonde hair and big blue eyes. They were a beautiful little family. But sadly, Josh faced many challenges due to being diagnosed with spina bifida. This is a defect in the backbone that impaired his ability to move his legs until he was able to eventually get the necessary surgery. Debbie was not sure who Josh's father was, so she raised him and Samantha as a single mom during this time. That would have been very difficult. It would be for anyone, but especially for a mother who is doing this all on her own. But one thing was for sure, everybody knew that Debbie loved her kids. They were her entire world. And in 1989, when Debbie was 22 years old, she started dating a 24-year-old man named James Edwards. And for the next 6 years, they had an on-again and off-again relationship. During their on periods, James lived with Debbie and her children, whom he was very good with. They essentially grew up with James when he was in their lives. But during the time they were off, Debbie met another man who was 4 years younger than her. His name was Laverne Ward, and he went by Vern. Now, their relationship remained very inconsistent, with Debbie alternating between Vern and James. And as close as she was with her mother and her sisters, Debbie did not divulge too much about the men in her life, as I stated before. So even though they had heard about some of the men who stuck around a little longer in Debbie's life, her family wasn't too familiar about her love life, even though they were very involved in the lives of her children. Debbie's mother, Jackie, got remarried in 1991 to another devout Baptist named Gary Arnold. Gary recalled that Debbie was the first to accept him and his 2 daughters from his previous marriage into the family. He said, quote, "Debbie was just a great girl, and man, she loved those kids," end quote. And there were more to come. On January 27, 1994, 27-year-old Debbie and her on-again, off-again 23-year-old boyfriend Vern had a son named Jordan together. And what a cutie pie. He definitely got daddy's genes. He had the deep brown eyes, the darker complexion than his siblings considering he was mixed race, with Debbie being white and Vern being black. Jordan was a very active and happy little boy. But despite having a child together, Debbie and Vern's relationship remained inconsistent, with Debbie continuing to alternate between dating Vern and then getting back with James and back and forth. But of these two men, James was much more stable. But Debbie had a big heart, and she would often try to help everyone in need. Even though she herself was on welfare, she would befriend many people, giving them a place to stay when they didn't have a home to go to. But this did open her up to being taken advantage of and enduring abusive relationships like the one with Vern. They definitely had domestic altercations throughout their relationship, so James was a much better fit. And Debbie just wanted someone who would truly love her and her children. And no one was quite sure why she would have put up with what she did in the past with men who treated her poorly. Sometimes there's a physical connection there, and it's really hard to break away, even in toxic situations. And that may have been why she would go back to Vern here and there. Plus, they did have a child together. But in her conversations with her mom and stepdad, Debbie still always left out specifics regarding her personal life, especially when it came to the fathers of her children. Because no matter how grown up Debbie was, Jackie and Gary still had a hard time with her getting pregnant and not being married. However, Debbie's biological father, Sam, he seemed less judgmental and more open to his daughter. Sam was always trying to lend a helping hand with his grandkids and maintain a relationship with Debbie. Now, at some point in 1994, Debbie decided to move to a safer part of Illinois with her 3 children. They moved into an apartment on the western edge of Addison, Illinois, on 675 North Swift Road in apartment 101. The apartment was a boxy 3-story brick complex with a sidewalk where the kids could play and a pool that they could swim in. Josh and Samantha started attending Black Hawk Elementary School, where they were known for being good students. They made many friends in the area. Samantha was friendly, while Josh was described as feisty and a little bit stubborn. Josh was not afraid to speak his mind, and he stood up for himself and others. He came a long way since the time that they discovered he had spina bifida. Now, he was athletic and tough, and he showed no fear, and he was very protective of his mother and his sister. They had all been through so much together, and in March of 1995, Debbie and James patched things up once again, and he moved into her apartment and got a steady job and was helping out with the kids and their expenses. Not too long after this, Debbie found out she was pregnant, and she shared the good news with her family and with James. They decided to name their soon-to-be-born son Elijah, and things were looking up for Debbie. She was very excited to be in a new place, have a steady relationship, and have another baby boy on the way. Fast forward to November of that same year, 1995, 28-year-old Debbie was now 9 months pregnant and was scheduled to go into the hospital on Sunday, November 19th for an induced labor and was expected to give birth on Monday, November 20th. But tragically, she would never make it to that appointment. At about 5:30 p.m. on the evening of Thursday, November 16th, James left for work at a distribution warehouse called Emmerich's, which was just down the street from their apartment that he shared with Debbie and the kids. It was walking distance, so he went there on foot. When he was finished with his shift at 2:30 in the morning, which is now in the early morning hours of November 17th, he walked up to their unit and noticed the lights were still on in the apartment, and that was not common for this hour. When he got to the back door, it was unlocked, which James thought was very odd. Debbie usually locked all the doors before she went to bed, and she would have been in bed by now. When he opened the door, he was met in the kitchen by little 22-month-old baby Jordan, who appeared to have blood on his face, feet, and clothing. So, of course, James was alarmed. He called out to Debbie, wondering where she could be and what happened to Jordan. As James walked into the living room, he saw Debbie lying face up on the floor between the coffee table and a love seat. She was still dressed in her regular daytime clothes that she had on when he left for work, and she was partially covered with a Winnie the Pooh blanket. At first, James thought that she was playing a joke on him because she had played these practical jokes on him in the past. So James walked up to Debbie and he tried lifting up her head, trying to get her to break the act. But she was limp. And James realized at that moment that something was very wrong and that this was not a joke. He quickly removed the blanket and was confronted with the horrific sight of Debbie's midsection covered in blood. It looked as though her stomach had burst open. And at that moment, James realized that Debbie was most likely deceased. And he figured it had something to do with her pregnancy. That's when he went into the children's bedroom to find out what happened. And right when he entered the room, he found 10-year-old Samantha lying on her bedroom floor in her Pocahontas nightshirt, and she was also covered in blood. He realized her neck had a wound on it. So James knew he had to run to get help. So he went to a neighbor's apartment and they called the police. When first responders from the Addison Police Department arrived, they found James in the living room, sitting next to Debbie on the floor. This man was distraught. He asked them several times, "Is she dead?" And once the officers cleared the apartment to make sure it was safe for EMS to enter, they were sent in around 2:43 a.m., and they were able to confirm that Debbie was dead. And sadly, so was her daughter, Samantha. They did a preliminary examination of Debbie's body. She was lying on her back in a blood-soaked shirt and pants with a large volume of blood underneath her. It appeared as though someone had performed a crude C-section on her, and the baby was no longer inside of her uterus. So where was he? EMS checked the small apartment and could not locate a newborn. However, they did find 22-month-old Jordan, and thankfully he did not have any injuries. The blood on his face, his feet, and his clothing had most likely come from either his mom, his sister Samantha, or both. And that's a frightening thought. No one knew what happened at this home and who was responsible for killing 2 members of this family, possibly 3. Officers asked James to tell them what he knew. He said that Debbie was 9 months pregnant with their son, who they planned to name Elijah, and that 10-year-old Samantha, 22-month-old Jordan, and Debbie's 7-year-old son Josh had been at home when he left for work. Now Josh was missing from the apartment, and of course, we're aware of what happened to Debbie and Samantha. Lots of things had to get done at this point. James needed to be brought in for questioning. Homicide investigators needed to come to the scene. Crime scene technicians had to comb all over this apartment for evidence, and there was a lot of it. There was blood everywhere, among other things, and officers needed to immediately jump into action to find 7-year-old Josh and newborn baby Elijah. James provided officers with a description of 7-year-old Joshua Ryan Evans. He was about 4 feet tall, with blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, and he was wearing a dark-colored shirt, black basketball shorts, and a green hooded jacket the last time he was seen. He also had a gold stud earring in his left ear, and he had just gotten his cast removed from his left arm earlier that same day before James left the apartment on November 16th. It had just healed from being broken. Josh was entered into the police system as missing and endangered, and police began to canvass the entire apartment complex. Meanwhile, crime scene technicians and homicide investigators arrived on the scene, including lead detective Sergeant Donald Sommers from the Addison Police Department, as well as an evidence technician. As Debbie's apartment was being processed by the team, they found their first piece of evidence outside of the apartment. On the sidewalk, there was one half of a broken pair of bloody poultry shears. These are heavy-duty scissors that are often used in the kitchen to prepare meats for cooking. They're stronger than regular scissors, and they're usually identifiable by a jagged middle section by the handles. This is usually used to break things open like walnuts or crab legs, for example, or even to open stubborn jars. Inside the apartment, the scene was horrifying. Investigators found blood in various locations all over. First, the living room where Debbie was found. That's where they located the other half of those bloody poultry shears. Then, as they made their way down the hallway that led to the 2 bedrooms and bathroom, there was blood all over the walls and the carpet on the floor, leading into the bathroom where they found a lot of blood droplets on the tile floor and the sink area, as well as inside the sink. In the children's bedroom, there was blood on the bed and on the floor where Samantha's body had been found. And now into the main bedroom, a dried blood stain was observed on the bed, as well as a blood-soaked ace bandage right next to it. When searching through the living room, investigators found a document on a hutch. It was addressed to Debra Evans, but it had a bloody fingerprint on it. They documented, photographed, and collected all of these items for DNA and fingerprint analysis. They then examined all the entry points to Debra's apartment and noticed the windows and the doors showed no signs of forced entry. This begged the question, how did the killer get into Debbie's unit? Had she let them inside? If so, that meant that she must know her killer. And that seemed like the most likely scenario for a number of reasons. The first is that visitors to this building had to be buzzed in by a resident in order to gain entry before they could access the front or back doors. So investigators assumed that the killer either had a key or that Debbie buzzed them in. But of course, they could have followed someone else in, they could have known someone who lived in the building, or maybe the killer lived in that same apartment complex or building. But there were other reasons investigators assumed that Debbie knew her killer, and that's because of the nature of this crime. Fetal abductions, which are also called Ceseasan kidnappings, are a very specific type of crime. They typically involve the pregnant woman being targeted by the perpetrator, and most of the time, that perpetrator develops some kind of relationship with them. Then they get closer and closer to this victim by using manipulation tactics, lying, pretending to be their friend, or a helpful medical professional, for example. It's uncommon that this is a random crime of opportunity because the victim has to be close to giving birth in order for the kidnapping to be executed properly and the fetus to be viable. Therefore, the perpetrator has to have personal knowledge of the victim's due date and other pertinent information. I'm going to have a lot more information to give to you about these types of crimes and the people who commit them. But for now, let's go back to this investigation. At this point, investigators met back at Addison Police Department where Debbie's boyfriend James was being interviewed, and her little toddler, Jordan, was taken into a room with an evidence technician. They took photographs of his condition. They collected swabs of blood found on his body. A total of 8 swabs were taken from his hairline, above his right eye, his right cheek, his right eyebrow, and right ear, as well as a couple from his forehead, bottom of his left foot, and the top of his tiny feet. All of these swabs were turned over for analysis. And by this time, Debbie's next of kin were being notified about her murder. They had been able to make contact with Debbie's mother, Jacqueline Arnold. They called her home in the middle of the night. Her husband, Gary, answered the phone, and when the caller asked for Jackie, he handed the phone off to her. Jackie's first thought was that this call could only mean one thing. Debbie's baby had been born and she was getting the good news. But instead, she was informed that her 28-year-old daughter, her pregnant daughter, had been killed, and that her 10-year-old daughter, Samantha, had also been found dead, and that her toddler, Jordan, was safe at the police station, waiting for a family member to come retrieve him. Jackie sat there frozen in her bed in those early morning hours, unable to comprehend what she just heard. The worst part was this wouldn't be the last time the police would relay terrible news to her. It was just the beginning of her living nightmare. The next to get the news was Debbie's sister, Wendy, and her husband, Daniel. Debbie's boyfriend, James, called Wendy from the police station around 4:30 in the morning. James said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but Debbie and Samantha are dead." You could imagine their shock hearing about everything that had happened. They agreed to make their way down to Addison PD to pick up little Jordan as fast as they could. But first, Wendy phoned her father, Sam. She could hardly speak. When Sam picked up the phone, she was just sobbing and crying, and Sam didn't know what was wrong. And finally, he heard the words, "Daddy, Daddy, Debbie's dead, Samantha's dead, and we can't find Joshua." Sam was stunned. He said, "What?" And no one knew what was going on. This was the worst news a family could ever get. Wendy and her husband wasted no time. They raced over to the police station to be with their nephew, Jordan, and talk to investigators. It was around 6 o'clock in the morning when they arrived, and Debbie's boyfriend, James, was being questioned. At the same time, Wendy and Daniel filled out all of the paperwork they needed for temporary custody of Debbie's son, Jordan. Afterward, the investigators wanted to speak with Daniel and Wendy to get an idea about who Debbie was, who was close to her, as well as whether they knew anyone who would want to harm her and her family. They explained Debbie was a very family-oriented woman, and she did not have any issues with her current boyfriend, James. They actually remarked that James would do anything for these kids and for Debbie, and he would never hurt her or the children. The only person that Wendy could think of that Debbie really had issues with in the most recent past was her ex-boyfriend, Vern, the father of 22-month-old Jordan. They described Vern as a member of the Four Corner Hustler gang, and that he had a violent side and a long criminal history. When he and Debbie dated, he would apparently lock her in closets and beat her up. They also thought that Debbie might have filed a restraining order against Vern, and that they had not been together for at least a year. The last time Wendy actually saw Vern was about 9 months earlier when he was over Debbie's visiting Jordan for his birthday party. However, Debbie had told her that she didn't really think that Jordan was Vern's child. She actually thought Jordan's father was her current boyfriend, James, and that she had let Vern know this in the past, but he still tried to be present in Jordan's life. She added that Vern had previously lived at the current apartment where Debbie was living, and that she thinks he used to have a key. She doesn't know if he still has one. The investigators wanted to know if Wendy knew of any family members or friends of Vern's that kept in contact with Debbie. And Wendy said, yeah, Debbie does keep in contact with Vern's family members. One cousin in particular, who was also pregnant at the time, was hanging out and talking to Debbie in the last few months, but she couldn't recall the woman's name. When asked about Joshua, Wendy said it was possible that Debbie could have let him go spend the night at a friend's house after James left for work. If so, they should try to check with friends, because Wendy said she didn't think the kids had school the next day, like it was a teacher's planning day or something. The last time Wendy spoke to Debbie was 2 days earlier, when Debbie called her to ask for some Thanksgiving recipes. But that's all the information that her and her husband could provide. Wendy mentioned that Debbie was closer to their other sister, Katie Evans, so investigators should definitely reach out to her. Maybe she could provide them with more information. So they get Katie's number, and then investigators sent Wendy and Dan on their way with Jordan and proceeded into the room to speak with Debbie's current boyfriend, James Edwards, who had been completely cooperative since the moment he called 911 several hours ago. James was very upset about what happened to Debbie and her daughter. He was also really concerned about missing Joshua, and he told the investigators he would do whatever they wanted for him to help. He even offered to take a polygraph test so they could rule him out and focus on whoever was really responsible for this. They told James that what they really needed right now was to know anything about an ex-boyfriend of Debbie's named Vern. James says, yes, he knows who he is. He also provided a description that he's a black male in his 20s that used to live with Debbie, and that they have a son together named Jordan. James said that Debbie had told him that Vern was abusive and that their relationship was merely physical and very tumultuous. Vern would, as I stated, lock her in closets and physically harm her. Investigators want to know if Vern has had any recent contact with Debbie, or if James has a reason to believe that Vern would actually want to harm her. James explained that Debbie would only speak to Vern regarding their toddler son Jordan, and that Vern had a new girlfriend that he lived with named Laura Hughes, but before her, there had been a woman named Brandy and another woman named Cynthia, all within the last year or two. You already know there's going to be a lot of people in this case, and I will do my very best to keep it organized for you. James also said that Vern does call over to Debbie's, and he'll ask about his son. As a matter of fact, in the last few weeks, Debbie and Vern had argued over the phone. It was about Jordan. Apparently, Vern wanted to take him for Thanksgiving, and Debbie said, you know what, I'm going to have to think about it. And this, of course, led to an argument. One of the many, including yelling matches about topics like child support, among other things. Investigators also want to know if James could give them any additional information on Debbie, like her friends, who she kept in contact with, as far as Vern's family was concerned, and whether she had been in any trouble lately. James explained that Debbie was acquaintances with several of their neighbors in the building and that she did keep in touch with some of Vern's family members, but he does not know all of them. He does know, however, that one of Vern's cousins named Annette talked to Debbie in the last few months because they were both pregnant and they had that in common. And she recently would come over and hang out at Debbie's place. As far as Vern was concerned, James said he hadn't seen or heard from him in at least a week or so. Just that one call about Jordan and Thanksgiving. At this point, the investigators took James back over to Debbie's apartment and they did a walkthrough. And they asked him if he could identify any items that appeared to be missing or anything in the apartment that didn't belong there. James said that that bloody ace bandage was not his. It did not belong to him or Debbie or anyone. He also said that he couldn't account for a black Walkman cassette player with headphones that belonged to Samantha. And investigators allowed James to collect a few personal items and clothing that belonged to him so that he had something to wear because this apartment was declared a crime scene. While he was going through his things, he told investigators that his mustard and white-colored Grambling State University Tigers starter jacket was missing. So they did make note of that. Before letting James go, they told him they needed his clothing so that they could analyze it for blood and DNA. He willingly took everything off, handed it to detectives, and they collected a purple long-sleeve button-down shirt, purple denim pants, and lace-up boots that were black. Then the investigators left and James was free to go as they checked on his alibi, and they also tried to get in touch with Debbie's other sister, Katie. Meanwhile, I need to tell you what the canvas of the building provided as far as clues and leads are concerned. Remember, after Debbie and Samantha were found, different teams of officers and investigators had done their jobs, and some were immediately deployed to Debbie's building to interview her neighbors and ask if they had heard or seen anything unusual. Their goal was to pinpoint a time frame in which Debbie and her daughter may have been killed, because at the time, they were working with a pretty big gap of time. James left work at around 5:30, and he found Debbie and her daughter dead around 2:30 in the morning. The canvass began at approximately 4 a.m., and I'm going to tell you the most significant information and people they spoke to. At 4:20 a.m., they arrived at Unit 102, which was right across from Debbie's. This is Brian Hennessy's apartment that he shared with his roommate, Rebecca Stubbs. James had run over to Brian's to make that 911 call at 2:45 a.m. Brian said that he heard someone frantically banging on his front door. He opened it to find James in a panic, asking to use his phone to call 911, and he wanted him to help him. He said that Debbie and Samantha were hurt. Brian said the last time he saw Debbie, Samantha, Josh, and Jordan was at 7:30 p.m. on November 16th. That would be the previous night after James left for work. Brian said that they were coming into the building. Josh and Samantha were both carrying laundry baskets, and Debbie was carrying her toddler, Jordan. That now closes up the timeline from 7:30 to 2:30 in the morning. Rebecca says she's very familiar with Debbie and her family. She's known them from before when she was dating Vern, and that Debbie had been with her current boyfriend, James, for about a year and a half. Now, back when Vern was in the picture, he used to come out and hang at Brian and Rebecca's all the time. She can't recall the last time she saw him, but she believed he was in jail and that he had been recently released. When asked about Joshua and whether she thought Debbie would have allowed him to spend the night at a friend's house, maybe someplace in the building or elsewhere, Rebecca said that was highly unlikely. She, unlike Wendy, didn't think Debbie would have allowed that. Rebecca explained that she had been present a number of times when little Joshua had asked Debbie to spend the night at a friend's house, and in the past, Debbie always said no. Instead, she told Josh to go ask his friends if they wanted to come stay the night at her place. The investigators went to several other apartments, and those tenants did not provide any relevant information. But they got to the apartment located right underneath Debbie's. It was the unit of Mark and Gail Jensen. They had a garden floor unit, so it's like just below ground. Gail told investigators that at approximately 10 p.m. on the 16th, she heard a lot of noise coming from Debbie's apartment, including a noise that sounded like something was falling in the hallway. Debbie said the noise struck her as very unusual because there was never a lot of noise coming from Debbie's apartment. Gail said she didn't see or hear anything else unusual for the rest of the night, and she recalls going to bed around 11 p.m., so she knows that the noise happened an hour prior to her getting into bed. Both Mark and Gail said they knew Debbie lived with her boyfriend James, and from what they could tell, he was good with her children. There were two other tenants that provided very useful information to police. A resident of Debbie's building named JC told officers that she heard what sounded like a single gunshot between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m. And that is very important. Another neighbor named Tenny said that around 9:15 p.m., she recalled seeing 4 people standing on a sidewalk talking to each other close to Debbie's building. When asked what they looked like, Tenny said she believed that it was 3 people that were Black and 1 light-skinned, maybe Hispanic individual. By the time the canvass was complete, it was around 5:30 in the morning on November 17th. And remember, around this time, James had been at the police station and he was interviewed, and Wendy and her husband were there picking up little Jordan. So there's so many moving parts to this investigation. So much is happening at the same time with different teams. Ultimately, investigators went out to James's place of business around 7 o'clock that morning, and they confirmed from a number of his coworkers and supervisors that James was at work the entire night from 5:40 p.m. on the evening of the 16th until the early morning hours at 2:30 a.m. on November 17th. He didn't even leave the building for his lunch break. The investigators even watched CCTV footage of James at his workplace. So at this point, James was ruled out as a suspect. Now remember that right after Debbie and Samantha were found, I told you that some of those officers canvassed the building. Well, there was another team of officers that were tasked with locating Debbie's missing 7-year-old son, Joshua, and her newborn baby, Elijah. And they immediately got on that. And throughout this investigation, all these teams were following up with one another with new information as they received it. First, officers drove around in the vicinity looking for anyone matching Joshua's description, and they made all police units aware of who they were on the lookout for. Their initial search did not turn up any leads, so they decided to bring in some bloodhounds. First, they brought in a canine named Angus, and they had him smell Joshua's bike helmet, which was right near the back door of the apartment. Angus took off, and he was on the trail of that scent. He went around the building out to the front parking area. Then Angus took his handler to the courtyard and then to several unit entrances before going out on Swift Road. He then crossed the street and went over to another complex called Swift Commons, where he sniffed around in a few swampy areas. These locations were checked by officers and nothing was found. So then a second bloodhound named Scarlett was placed at the back door of Debbie's apartment. And this time, to get acquainted with Joshua's scent, they used one of his used pair of underwear. The hound also took the same trail Angus did around the building to the front parking lot area. And just like Angus, Scarlett went to the courtyard and then to Swift Road, where she showed interest in a northern direction. This alerted officers that Joshua was most likely taken by car, as the scent was lost at this location. Now, a third hound named Ginger was sent in to confirm the 2 previous canines' trails. This time, Ginger was placed at the front door and was acquainted with Joshua's scent through a pair of his used pants. Ginger made her way out to the courtyard, just like Angus and Scarlett had done, then out to Swift Road. And then he began walking north. This confirmed to investigators that Joshua and probably the newborn baby Elijah had been taken from this apartment by car, and they went north. While all this was going on, investigators finally reached Katie Evans, Debbie's other sister, who had already been informed about Debbie and Samantha's murders. Katie said that just a few months before all this, in August, Vern told Debbie that he thought he was the father of the baby she was carrying. And Debbie told him, "No, you are not." And there was no way that he was going to involve himself in Elijah's life. She also told him he wasn't going to be able to see Jordan either. And Katie went on to say that just 2 days before the murders, Debbie told her that she was worried. She said Vern had been harassing her, calling her nonstop, and just picking fights with her for no reason. Debbie was scared that something was going to happen to her, and she asked Katie to please take care of her children if anything did. That's pretty telling. After speaking with Debbie's loved ones, police thought that Vern was a solid suspect for these murders, so they started to look for him. We already know that according to Debbie's sister Wendy, Vern was in a gang, he had a criminal record, and he's hurt Debbie before. And Debbie's boyfriend James told investigators the same thing, and he also knew that Vern had been arguing with Debbie over seeing Jordan and that Vern had harmed Debbie in the past. James also gave investigators the names of a few of Vern's ex-girlfriends. One of those names, Cynthia, caught the attention of another officer. He was aware of a man that he had arrested before named Vern Ward, and he knew a Cynthia Aguilar in connection with that man. He decided to just do some work on his own and check their system for Cynthia's information, and sure enough, he was able to find a number of altercations involving the 2 of them at several different addresses in an area called Carroll Stream, and another address for Vern at Debbie's apartment in Addison, Illinois. So investigators made a call out to Carroll Stream PD, and asked for all records involving Laverne Ward, including photos, fingerprints on file. After they were retrieved, the investigators went to the last known address for Cynthia where Vern had lived, but she wasn't home. A roommate advised them that she was actually at work at a Target store in the area. As for Vern, the roommate said he had not seen him in a long time. Then the roommate gave the investigators permission to look around Cynthia's apartment. Nothing of significance was found, so they left to find her at Target. They arrived there around 8:15 in the morning on November 17th, just hours after the murders. They located Cynthia, and they asked her if she was still in contact with Vern. She told them she was, but that was because they actually had a 4-year-old daughter together named Victoria. She said she met Vern about 5 or 6 years before this. They used to live together as a couple, but they hadn't been together for 2 years now. They only kept in touch for the sake of their daughter. However, she found it a little strange that he paged her out of the blue the night before. And yes, we were all using pagers and beepers back then instead of cell phones. But she got a page between 7:30 and 8 p.m. This would have been on the night that Debbie was last seen, probably just before she was murdered. Cynthia called the number that paged her, which was not the number that Vern usually used. A woman answered, and then she yelled at Vern to come to the phone. Vern said that night would have been him and Cynthia's 5-year anniversary if they had never broken up, and he wanted to come see her tomorrow at work. Cynthia said he was talking nonsense because he smoked crack, and I'm being serious. She wasn't joking saying that. She explained he dealt and smoked crack, and that she really did not expect Vern to come see her. He had a habit of calling her when he was high like that and had recently gone to jail for dealing drugs. When asked about whether Cynthia knew anything about Debbie, she said that she knew that it was Vern's ex, that he dated Debbie, and that they had a child together. But Cynthia said that summer, Vern told her that Debbie and Vern had a blood test done and he was not the father of toddler Jordan, and that she overheard a phone call between Vern and Debbie with James Edwards in the background, and they were all arguing over who Jordan's father was. So investigators get the number Vern paged Cynthia from and asked her if she knew where he was currently living. Cynthia said that she thought Vern was staying with a 30-year-old woman who worked at McDonald's named Laura that lived out in Wheaton. She also provided investigators with all of Vern's family members, their names, and there were a lot of them who lived in Illinois. I am not going to list them. He had brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, a lot of people to contact and interview. Then Cynthia actually went above and beyond. She drew a map to where she believed Laura lived so that they could make contact and locate Vern. She was very helpful to this investigation. They ran that number on Cynthia's pager, and it came up to an apartment of a woman named Martha Martin at 516 Crescent in Wheaton, Illinois. So they headed out there around 9:30 in the morning, and eventually they made contact with Martha. She said Vern did not live there. Vern was her husband Curtis's nephew. So essentially, it's her nephew as well by marriage. She also told investigators they were welcome to search her residence to make sure Vern was not there. And while walking through, one of the detectives did a quick look-see into one of the bedrooms, and he saw a caller ID box. He looked at the last numbers who called Martha, and it showed at 8:01 on the 16th, Cynthia called, which matched up to what she said. While the detectives were still at Martha's, her adult daughter, 22-year-old Tina Martin, came home. They asked if they could speak with her regarding her cousin Vern, and she said yes. She explained that she lived there with her parents and her 2 sons, and that Vern had come over the night before to hang out for a bit. She remembered him paging one of his ex-girlfriends. She answered when the ex called back, and she handed the phone to Vern. At this point, they asked if she could explain all of the numbers on the caller ID, which she did. Then they asked Martha what she did the night before while Vern came to visit, and Martha explained she was at work at Sony in Carroll Stream. She left for work around 3:30 p.m., and she didn't get back until 12:30 a.m. And when she got in there at around 1:10 in the morning, she saw her daughter Tina, Tina's 2 sons, and Martha didn't observe anything out of the ordinary. The investigators thanked the ladies for their time, and they left. By 11 a.m. that same day, November 17th, Debbie and Samantha's autopsies were being conducted by pathologist Dr. Shaku Tees. Dr. Tees started with Samantha and followed up that examination with Debra. This would take several hours to complete. But I do want to share the doctor's findings with you. I'll start with 10-year-old Samantha. Rigor mortis had already set in by the time her body was received by Dr. Tees. She was clothed in just a pair of underwear and a Pocahontas nightgown. Blood was drawn for DNA analysis. Dr. Tees observed multiple stab and incised wounds to her neck. For those of you that may not know, I always get these confused. A stab wound is usually deeper than it is wide, and an incised wound is wider than it is deep. It's more of a slash or a slice. I'll tell you where the stab wounds were located. There were 6 in total. They're not numbered in any particular order. The first was on the right side of her neck. It was 4 centimeters deep and went through the skin and muscle but did not hit the carotid artery or jugular vein. It was noted that the margins were irregular, indicating this could have been caused by a more dull knife rather than a very sharp or straight edge knife. Below that wound, there was a second about 3 centimeters deep with the same irregular edge. That one also did not hit any major arteries or veins. On the left side of the neck, there was a third wound, very similar to the other 2. The larynx and the trachea were still intact and were not hit. Below that, there was a 4th wound, similar to the others, and below that, a 5th. However, when it comes to the 6th stab wound on the left side, it was a large gaping wound that completely cut through the jugular vein, hitting the vagus nerve, as well as the spine, and severing the 5th cervical vertebra, fracturing it, essentially breaking her neck. This wound also caused hemorrhaging all the way up to the orbital region and was at least 7 centimeters deep. This 6th wound would have certainly been fatal. Now, as for the incised wounds or slashes, there were 6. They were located on the right side of her neck. A second on the left upper arm. This one was also about 1 centimeter deep, so it was almost like a stab wound that was dragged. A third was located on her elbow, a 4th on her forearm, a 5th on her left ear, and a 6th behind her right ear. The wounds to Samantha's forearm show that she was attempting to defend herself by putting her arms up to protect her head and face. The more superficial cuts on her ears could indicate she was going through a struggle while moving her head back and forth to avoid being more severely wounded, but unfortunately, she was no match for her assailant. Dr. Tees listed her cause of death as multiple stab and incised wounds. So sad that this innocent little girl had to die on account of what she witnessed in that apartment that night. They checked for any sexual-related injuries, and there were none of that nature observed. This was collateral damage, and it is unfortunate and completely senseless. So now let me discuss Debbie's autopsy findings. Rigor mortis had already set into her body as well when it was received by Dr. Tees. Debbie was wearing a gray striped sweater top, yellow pants, a white bra, and black underwear. There was blood present in her hair, and upon further examination, Dr. Tees found a bullet wound to the back of her head. The projectile traveled through the back and to the front and through her brain to the front of her skull, and it was lodged in that area behind her forehead. A small caliber copper-jacketed bullet was recovered. There was a stab wound to her neck to the front right, and just like Samantha's, the edges were irregular and blunted. There were 3 incised wounds. The first was above that stab wound, the second was on the left side of the neck, and the third was close to the second on the same left side. But now for the most horrific wound. There was a 12-inch slash across Debbie's lower abdomen from one side to the other. The margins of this wound were irregular. The uterus and placenta were pulled through this opening, and a portion of the umbilical cord could be seen protruding. And interestingly, right above the deep slash, there was a similar incised wound running horizontally, but it was only 4 inches in length, almost as though this was a practice slash before the lower one was executed. And above this more superficial slash, there was another wound, 4 centimeters in length, and through it, you could see an enlarged uterus and part of the placenta and the umbilical cord. This wound hit a portion of her small bowel. The uterus had been cut through and opened, and the umbilical cord had been cut, and it had a clean, sharp edge like it was done with a strong pair of scissors. The placenta was still inside, and the fetus had been removed. Blood, bile, and urine were drawn for toxicology and electrolytes, and blood is also drawn for the crime lab and possible DNA analysis. Blood was also taken from the umbilical cord since it contained the DNA of the missing fetus. Dr. Tees listed Debra Evans' cause of death as a result of a gunshot wound to the back of her head and stab wounds to her abdomen involving the uterus and the gastrointestinal tract, and stab and incised wounds to her neck. Dr. Tease was not able to determine the order of Debbie's wounds from the autopsy alone. In her opinion, the main cause of Debbie's death was the gunshot wound, and someone had essentially performed a C-section on Debbie using those poultry shears that were found on the scene. What Debbie had to go through is beyond imaginable. Baby Elijah was gone from the womb, and there was a question about whether or not Elijah could even be alive. Dr. Tease told police that a fetus can survive in the womb as long as the mother's heart is beating. After the mother's heart stops, the fetus can only survive for 3 to 5 minutes. That meant the killer or killers had to work very quickly to perform the C-section. The reason Dr. Tease remarked that there could have been more than one person involved in this murder is because it usually takes more than one person to carry out a C-section delivery in a medical setting. We will get into this in just a moment because investigators consult with another doctor, Debbie's obstetrician and gynecologist, Dr. Christopher Olson, regarding the possibility of Elijah still being alive. They had Dr. Olson look over Debbie's autopsy and the crime scene, and he told the investigators that the blood spatters that were around Debbie's body suggested her heart was still beating when Elijah was cut out of her womb, which meant it was possible for him to still be alive. This further brought up the question, how many people did it take to perform the C-section on Debbie? Dr. Olson said that when a C-section is performed in an appropriate medical manner, 3 people are required to deliver a child, 2 physicians and 1 assistant. He said if there was no concern for the well-being of the mother and child, like there clearly didn't seem to be in Debbie's case, sadly, then fewer people would be needed. Dr. Olson said, however, he believed more than 2 hands would be needed to deliver a baby by C-section, particularly if the horizontal incision, such as the one on Debbie's abdomen, was made. Dr. Olson further explained that the incision used to remove the baby from Debbie's uterus was at the back of the uterus. Therefore, the uterus must have been pulled to the side or lifted out of the abdomen to make this cut. So according to Dr. Olson, it was unlikely that this could have been accomplished by one person alone. And I'm so sorry that I had to explain it the way that I did, because it's terrifying and it's tragic. And that's why I told you this can be very triggering. I didn't know how sad I was going to feel about thinking about what Debbie went through, being so excited and anticipating the birth of Elijah, and then thinking of her last moments. It makes me so upset. And now I know I just said that 2 medical professionals gave their expert opinions on how many people it would take to commit a successful fetal abduction. When I use the word successful, I mean that the baby remains alive, which is the goal that these perpetrators have in these types of cases. But what I want to point out is even though both doctors believe that it could have been more than one person, there have unfortunately been babies stolen from women who have been killed, and their babies have survived, and the C-sections were carried out by just one person. So it is possible. Investigators have a lot to figure out here because they're trying to think of the most likely suspect or suspects. You may have heard that the number one reason a pregnant woman is murdered is due to intimate partner violence. And the killer is usually their spouse, boyfriend, or partner, someone close to them that either doesn't want the baby or maybe the couple has broken up and the man doesn't want the woman raising the baby with someone else. The list goes on. But those are not fetal abductions. Those are murders of a woman and their child. Fetal abductions are quite different. In these cases, the perpetrator are usually women. Most times, they're women who can't get pregnant due to medical conditions or other reasons, and they really desire a baby of their own. So they resort to killing a pregnant woman and stealing the baby right from the womb. In fetal abductions, the killer usually pretends that they're pregnant for months until they can kidnap that baby. The whole idea is that they want to pass the baby off as their own as much as possible. They often go through painstaking effort, creating things like fake ultrasound pictures and social media posts showing them looking pregnant. And they go to great lengths to make sure that their family and even their partner are duped. And many times, they'll have baby showers, among other events, to prepare for their new baby. All the while, what they're really planning for is to murder their victim and kidnap their unborn child. And sadly, one of the number one reasons women resort to this is to keep the man that they're with. Yeah. In a lot of these cases, their partner wants a child or a child of a particular gender, for example, and they can't give it to him. So they think that he's going to leave. In order to make him stay, they concoct a plan to steal someone else's child. Adoption's not an option because they want the baby to be passed off as their partner's child and fool him into thinking it is. All of this being said, investigators in Debbie's case are trying to figure out whether this is a true fetal abduction or more of a family murder where the killer intended to wipe out as many people in Debbie's life as they could, including her unborn child. But the fact that the baby was taken out the way that it was led them to believe the perpetrator wanted the baby alive and not dead. Since their only person of interest so far is Vern Ward, they wonder if they're on the right track. Sure, he wanted time with Jordan, who he claimed was his son and who Debbie initially claimed belonged to Vern. But we know that both of them have also made claims that he wasn't his. So why leave 22-month-old Jordan behind? You'd think the father of his own child, who had just been fighting with Debbie to see him, would have taken him and that opportunity to just snatch him up. Why take 7-year-old Josh? Why kill Samantha and Debbie and leave Jordan behind? It was a very complicated case. But it stands to reason whoever took Josh took Elijah too. So the hunt for these two boys is in the forefront of this investigation. Time is of the essence, and it's ticking away. By 9 o'clock in the morning, officers had arrived at Joshua's elementary school, hoping to gain access to not only information about friends Josh could be staying with, but contact information for anyone that knew Josh and could provide any information about his whereabouts. But they also wanted to inquire about whether the school had any insight into what the Evans kids' home life was like. This is when things get a little contradictory from what investigators had initially gleaned from family and friends of Debbie. They speak with the school social worker, Linda Claft, and she advised the investigators that she had been speaking with Joshua regarding his home life. He confided in her that he didn't know who his biological father was, and his mother lived with several men over the last few years, including her most recent boyfriend, James Edwards. But here's the thing. Josh, who would have no reason to lie about this, told her that James had gotten physical towards him, that he'd slapped him. He'd kicked him on numerous occasions. She said that Joshua had told her the beatings stopped when James moved out last time, and that Joshua called these beatings whoopings. She said that she understood that James had moved back in the previous June, and that some of these whoopings had started again. Linda also let the officers know that Joshua had fallen out of a tree in early September and broken his arm. She confirmed that he had a green cast on his forearm, which was just removed on November 16th at an unknown doctor's office. And I mentioned that earlier. On the same day the Evans family was last seen, Josh had just gotten his cast off his arm. Now, I don't think she was insinuating that Josh's broken arm was a result of these whoopings from James, but she did mention the two together. Nevertheless, investigators make a note to not entirely rule out the possibility that James was somehow involved. It didn't seem likely given the timeline, unless he had someone carry out these murders on his behalf. The other information that was gathered from the school consisted of friends of Josh that he hung out with, including their names and their parents' contact information in case Josh had somehow fled his home during the time his mother and sister were being attacked and went to a friend's. Those individuals were contacted, but unfortunately, they had no information regarding Josh's whereabouts. But soon a major tip was about to come in that would lead this investigation in the right direction and crack open this entire case, clue by clue. A 911 call came in around 12:30 p.m. on November 17th. This is still the first day that investigators have been working on this case. Everything happened pretty quickly. So much was going on at once. This 911 call came in from a man named Dwight Pruitt. He said that he was calling from a payphone in the city of Villa Park, which is about 10 minutes away from Addison, where Debbie's apartment was located. According to this caller, he had been watching the news. He saw a picture of Joshua Ryan Evans, And it was in that moment he recognized that little boy. His girlfriend, Patrice Scott, had been babysitting a little boy the night before that looked exactly like him and had the same name. However, at the time Dwight was calling, he told the operator that his girlfriend had left their apartment with that little boy and that someone came to their apartment and took him, and Patrice went with them. He has no idea where they're headed. The dispatcher sent out 2 investigators in marked Villa Park police cars to the address provided by Dwight, 1649 South Michigan, unit number 105. By the time they got there, Patrice was back. As you heard, Joshua's picture had been on TV just a few hours after the murders. This case was one of the top stories in Chicago. And sadly, Debbie's family didn't know that her unborn baby was cut from her womb. Can you imagine finding out that way on the news? How heartbreaking. It was during a news conference. An officer explained that someone opened up Debbie's stomach and removed the newborn that she planned to name Elijah. Just as Debbie's father, Sam, was seeing this on the news, his phone rang, and it was a detective relaying the same heartbreaking information. Sam could not believe it. He was so upset. He asked, "Where's the baby?" And the detective tells him they do not know, that they've been checking everywhere in bushes, trash cans, and dumpsters because they believe that he's probably dead. And they're turning now to the media for help, hoping that someone out there has information about who could have done this. Investigators are hoping Dwight and Patrice can help. Dwight starts by talking to Detective Wall and his partner, first telling them what he remembers about Joshua being at their apartment. He told investigators it was 1 o'clock in the morning. He was on the couch in the living room watching TV. The heat of the night show was on, when all of a sudden, there was a loud knocking coming from the window in the front of their apartment. Dwight looked out there and saw who he described to the police as, quote, a black female friend of Patrice's, end quote. He got up, he went to the bedroom. He told Patrice to come to the door and speak with her friend. She did. And Dwight said the 2 women talked for a few minutes, and then he saw Patrice bringing a small white boy who he now recognizes as Joshua into their apartment. And the first thing Dwight notices is that Joshua's only wearing a t-shirt, boots, a jacket, and underwear. And he wasn't wearing any pants. And for whatever reason, Dwight called out to the boy and asked him, "Why are you dressed like that?" And he said because that's all he had to put on before he left. At this point, investigators now turn to Patrice for a complete understanding of why this child was supposedly dropped off at her apartment in the middle of the night. And she is reluctant to talk. She tells them she doesn't want to get anybody in trouble, and she doesn't want to get in trouble either. But before investigators could even press her on this matter, Dwight interrupted, and he began to yell at Patrice, saying, quote, "All the officers want is to find that boy. How would you feel if this was your child? You're going to tell them everything you know, and you're going to tell them now," end quote. Patrice explained that she lived there with her boyfriend Dwight and their 3 daughters, one of which was only about a month old at the time. As Dwight had already said, they got a knock at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was her friend Annette Williams, who was there to ask Patrice for help. Annette explained her friend Debbie had been shot in a drug deal gone wrong, and that Debbie's son Josh ran to her as he was running from the shooter. Annette tells Patrice she needs to find out about Debbie's condition and possibly go to the hospital and be by her side. So she asked Patrice to please hold on to Josh until she could figure out what was going on. Patrice asked her, "Why did you bring him here?" And Annette explained the shooting happened on the west side and Patrice's house was close by. She promised she would be back at 9 a.m. to come retrieve Josh. When asked if Patrice noticed anything unusual about Annette's appearance, she said, "Not really." She had on a blue baseball cap and a green dress. But it did look like she could have had some blood on that dress. There was kind of a brown stain on it. Patrice tells the investigator she brought Joshua into the apartment and closed the door. And that's when Josh asked her, "Are you going to lock the door? The burglars are going to come looking for me." Patrice, even though this wasn't her normal habit, she locked the door so that Josh would calm down because he was really shaken up. She made a bed for him out in the living room, and Patrice stated that Josh started to wake up crying hysterically at about 6 o'clock that morning. She asked him what was wrong. She was trying to comfort him. And that's when Josh told her that 4 black men had come into his mom's apartment. 2 men climbed through a bedroom window. His mom was pregnant and she was dead. And they cut her stomach. And they cut his sister. And there was blood all over. And he had to go back and get his baby brother, who was still in the apartment. Patrice stated that she asked Josh where he lived, and he said Indian Trails, Pebble Ridge. She said, "That's Addison." And he said, "Yeah, in Addison." Then Patrice asked Josh how he got away. And he told her that when the bad men left, he ran outside, and that's when he saw Annette, and he ran to her and went with her. Investigators want to know who this Annette person is and how she would be connected to Debbie. So Patrice explained they were friends, and they knew one another through Debbie's ex, Vern, that Annette is Vern's cousin. I know this is a lot to take in. The most important part is finding out where Josh is now. Remember how Dwight said to the 911 operator that he saw Josh leave with Patrice and her friend? Well, investigators want to know what Patrice can tell them about where they went with Josh and where he is now. She explained that Annette did come back as she promised at 9 a.m. with her boyfriend Fidel, and they were driving their gray Mercury Sable. Patrice was in shock of what the little boy had told her happened at Debbie's. So she confronted Annette as soon as she got there, asking what really happened, what is going on. She wanted to understand because she didn't want to be involved in any of this. And now she felt like Annette was putting her in the middle. Well, Annette gets really angry. She told Patrice, "Don't listen to him. He's a liar." Annette stayed and talked to Patrice for a little while, and then she said she needed to go get something from Walmart and drop off Josh. Concerned for his safety, Patrice goes with them. Patrice tells investigators she knows they drove into a town near where Annette lives in Schaumburg near Hoffman Estates. Then she thinks they drove to Melrose Park down Charles Road, and Annette dropped Josh off at a house that had a gangway and a gray chain link fence in the front with a gate. Patrice explained that she does not know the address, but she knows she can take them there because she will remember it if she sees the area. And of course, time is ticking by. So Patrice, Dwight, their baby daughter, and the 2 detectives get into a squad car, and they started to head in the direction that Patrice is instructing them to drive. Meanwhile, Detective Wall calls Detective Sergeant Sommers and explains they need backup. They inform him of the situation and the location that they're going to be investigating as a potential area where Joshua Evans could be. So Sommers sends additional investigators out to that vicinity to assist with the search. After driving for about 20 minutes, they make it to a town called Maywood, and they drove up and down the alleys as Patrice tried to recall where she saw Josh get dropped off. All of a sudden, Detective Wall thinks he sees something. He almost jumped out of the car while it was still moving. They stopped, and in the distance was what appeared to be a young boy that matched Josh's description lying on the ground in an alleyway between 20th and 21st Streets in Maywood. He radioed the other detectives, and they convened in that alley. There on the ground was a white male child with blonde hair, wearing a green jacket, no pants, blood-stained jockey-type underwear, and brown boots, who appeared to be lifeless. It looked like he had been thrown from a vehicle and was now lying next to a possible abandoned house on the west side of this alley. Investigators called the Mayport Police Department for assistance and advised that they believed they had just located the deceased body of Joshua Ryan Evans from the Addison double murder. Wow, this is unbelievable. Detective Wall, Dwight Pruitt, and Patrice Scott traveled to the Maywood Police Department for interviews, and at the same time, Cook County Mobile Crime Lab officers were called in to conduct an extensive processing of the body before it was removed and brought in for an autopsy. Josh was dead. This was now a triple homicide, and still, there's no one in custody. It's unreal. It just keeps getting worse. And they still haven't located baby Elijah. But at least they have some possible leads. 2 new names, Annette Williams, who we know is Vern's cousin, and her boyfriend, Fidel Caffey. So again, Vern's name is connected to this case. They need to track all of them down. In order to find Vern, they look up his current girlfriend, Laura Hughes, and her apartment in Wheaton at 1709 Roosevelt, Unit 265, and they head out there. When they arrive, her roommate, Jeff Lyda, answers the door. He tells investigators that he resides with Laura and her 3 daughters, but Laura's boyfriend, Vern, had also been staying there. They asked Jeff, "When's the last time you've seen him?" And he said that he saw Vern locked out of their apartment around 10:15 the night before. He explained that they usually leave a window open to get in and out when Laura or her adult daughter Christina weren't home, but someone closed it. So Jeff used an ID to unlock their door. And he said that Vern was home for the rest of the night. And then they went to bed. And then at 4 a.m., Vern woke Jeff up, told him to drive him out to Chicago in Laura's car because he couldn't drive manual transmission, and he wanted to go pick up some things and party. He said they were home by 8 o'clock in the morning. He's not really sure what Vern did after that, but he knows that Laura got up around that time, and he doesn't know where they are now. As the investigators are interviewing Laura's daughters and looking around the apartment with Jeff's permission, guess who pulls up out front? Laura and Vern. Laura was driving, and Vern was partially laying down in the back seat. No one was in the front passenger seat. They immediately told Vern not to move and for Laura to stop the vehicle. Then they instructed Vern to exit the car with his hands in sight. He cooperated, they patted him down, and then they placed him into the back of a police car to be brought to Addison for questioning. Laura willingly comes down to be interviewed as well. It is now 2 p.m. They ask her if she knows Debbie and how she knows Vern and what her relationship is to them. Laura explains that she's been dating Vern, and he's been living with her and her 3 daughters and her roommate, Jeff. She says she knows Debbie as one of Vern's exes and the mother of his son, Jordan, and that she's currently pregnant. However, Laura said that it appeared that when Debra was getting along with Vern, she would tell him that the baby she was carrying was his. But when she was not getting along with Vern, she would tell him that the baby was James's baby. And according to other people Laura talked to, like Vern's cousins Tina and Annette and other family members, they were told by Debbie that the unborn baby was Vern's. Nobody knew for sure. And Laura personally does not know much about Debbie, but said that she remembered her coming by her place with Josh and Jordan during the summer when Vern was meeting them for a picnic for Jordan's birthday. Now investigators want to know where Laura was the night before. Laura said she was working from 3:30 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., and she spoke to Vern a few times during her shift. At one point, he came by around 4 or 4:30, picked her up a salad, and then he went to his friend's Malcolm's for a bit, and he called her from there. Then he called her again when he was at his cousin Tina's house. Remember Tina was interviewed? She was the one that let the investigators look through her caller ID box. We already know that Vern was over at Tina's for a little while that night. While there, he apparently yelled at Laura over the phone because she had him locked out of the house. Vern told her he was just going to be hanging out at people's houses until she or Christina could come unlock the door. Laura expected Christina to come pick her up from work, and meanwhile, no one showed up to help Vern. So he made another angry phone call to her around 9:30 or 10, saying it was really cold outside, and he was waiting for her at the White Hen across the street from their house. Laura's daughter picked her up from work at 11:30, and Laura drove back home to drop her off and then proceeded to meet some coworkers for pizza, followed by going to a store. And then she returned home around 3 a.m. And when she did, she said she saw Vern eating some bacon and sitting in bed watching TV. He explained that he and Jeff ended up having to use an ID to get into the locked door earlier, and that ended up becoming an argument. Laura said they were fighting for at least an hour while everyone in the apartment was sleeping, including her daughters and their roommate Jeff. But after this, Vern woke Jeff up and the two of them left the house to head to Chicago to party, which means to go pick up and also use drugs. She said he didn't return until 8 in the morning, and that's when he woke Laura up to go visit his uncle that was in town from Alabama. So they drove all the way back out to Chicago and returned home that afternoon when investigators caught up with them. So when would Vern have had time to go over Debbie's to kill her and her daughter and steal her unborn baby in Addison? He seemed to be calling Laura multiple times a night, over at his cousins that evening, at friends' houses, back at Laura's house at 10, and then out to Chicago with Jeff, and again with Laura, which is about that same time they got that call from Dwight about seeing Patrice with Josh. They still need to track down Annette and her boyfriend Fidel and question them about why they were last seen with Josh Evans. When Vern was informed about the reason they brought him to the station, that Debbie and her daughter Samantha and her son Josh had been killed, Vern adamantly denied that he had anything to do with these murders, and he said he would never harm a child. That's when the police mentioned they think his cousin Annette and her boyfriend Fidel are involved in these murders. Vern did become a little defensive, But he did agree to continue to cooperate, and he stayed at the station to answer more questions if they needed it. They asked him to recount his entire day on the 16th into the 17th before police made contact with him, and I am not going to go into every little detail that this man provided. I told you he has a lot of family members in this area. I've already told you about several of them, and throughout the past 2 days, he was all over the place, house to house, city to city, hanging out, partying, hooking up with women, going back to Laura's, and a bunch of different places in between. But for the most part, when investigators reached out to confirm Vern had been all these spots, the individuals said they mentioned seeing him there. But a couple of them mentioned seeing him with Annette and Fidel on more than one occasion on the 16th, which would have been the last time that anyone saw Debbie and her kids alive. He admitted that he did see them, and it was about 3:30 or so. He was driving with his other cousin, John, and they spotted Annette and Fidel in their gray Sable at a stoplight. They talked for a minute, and then they turned around to follow John and Vern back to Vern's apartment complex parking lot. Annette was letting him know it was one of her daughter's birthdays that day, and she was also going to watch her son's basketball game at Franklin Middle School, with Fidel and her going out to dinner later to celebrate. Vern told her he would try to make it to the game. They parted ways, and then him and John proceeded to go hang out with friends, have some beers, and then he stopped by Laura's to drop off that salad. Remember that? Then he went to Malcolm's for a while, and he did stop by the middle school. He looked for Annette and Fidel around 7 p.m., and he couldn't find them. Some kids were standing outside. They let him know the game was already over. That's when he arrived back at Laura's to find out he was locked out. So he hitched a ride back to his Aunt Martha's house, and that's where Tina lives. Tina is actually Annette's sister. They don't share the same name. Annette is 29. She's no longer living at home. She's been married and divorced. Vern said while he was at Tina's, he made several calls. One was to his current girlfriend, Laura, but he also called a few of his exes. We heard about Cynthia. But he said he called Debbie and Brandy and Cassandra. He said he didn't get a hold of Debbie at first, but she eventually called him back, and all they did was talk about Jordan. He said it was a normal conversation. He stayed over his aunt's house maybe until 9, and that's when he walked back to Laura's. And he finally met Jeff outside, and the two unlocked the door with the ID card, and the rest of the story was the same as Laura's and Jeff's. Even though it seems like all of Vern's time is accounted for, it really isn't. There are so many holes in his timeline. But Vern remained at the station while investigators were continuing to search for Fidel and Annette. Now they call Vern's cousin back, Tina Martin, Annette's sister. She comes down to the station hoping that she could help them fill in some blanks and also track them down. For one, investigators want to know more about Annette and Fidel. So through Tina and others and doing a background check, here's what they found out. Vern is actually very close friends with Annette's boyfriend, Fidel Caffey. That's actually how Annette met Fidel, through Vern. Annette's legal name is actually Jacqueline. Her middle name is Annette. She was born in 1966, and her home life was tainted from the very beginning due to her parents' bitter divorce. This was before her mother was married to Vern's uncle. Martha wanted a fresh start, so they moved from Alabama to Chicago, but because of the gang violence that was happening there, they moved to the safer suburb of Wheaton. Martha tried her very best to keep Annette on the straight and narrow, but by 16, she was already involved with drugs and men. Martha still tried to control her, but by 17, Annette had dropped out of high school and was pregnant. By the time she was 20, she already had 3 children and a husband, and she made the decision to get her tubes tied because they were already struggling and on welfare. But 3 years later, she became a single mom, and she was doing worse than ever. That's when she started turning to petty crime to make ends meet. She went to jail in 1991 for theft, and she was arrested again not too long after getting out of jail for writing bad checks. But something good seemed to come out of this. While she was on probation, she enrolled in a nursing program and got her certification as a nursing assistant. She was turning her life around, and things were looking up. Until she met Fidel Caffey, who was only 2 years out of high school at the time, and she was 27. He already had gun charges, violence against women. He'd struck a man over the head with a bottle, had a number of narcotics charges, and was overall not a great guy. Fidel was born in 1973 in Schaumburg, Illinois. He had a chaotic home life. He grew up with his mother and his maternal grandmother, both of which had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Fidel's everyday home life consisted of constant screaming, yelling, and very delusional behavior. He witnessed things like feces being smeared across the walls of their home, his mother and grandmother dunking each other's head in the toilet, and possibly had this done to him as well. He had to endure very disturbing and bizarre behaviors that he probably assumed were normal because it was all that he knew. Fidel's father had rejected him, saying that he thought his mom cheated while they were together and Fidel was not his. The only male father figure he had was his grandpa, but he proved to have his own setbacks. To try to escape the chaos, his granddad carried on a relationship with another woman, and he would leave Fidel behind and stay over there when things got rough. The two disturbed women Fidel was left with, his mom and grandma, those were the only constants in his life. And his grandpa, who was the closest thing he had to a dad, ended up dying in 1991, and this brought Fidel to a new low. He started doing and selling drugs and ended up fathering a child with his high school girlfriend, but that relationship ended, and Fidel continued to turn to the streets. He needed someone to help him work some of his territories, and that is where his good friend Vern comes in. He hired him to be one of his drug runners, and just 2 years later, he ends up meeting Vern's cousin, Annette. They got together pretty quickly, and soon Annette was living with Fidel, but they had a very toxic relationship. It appeared as though Fidel would seek out women who would bring utter chaos into his life. It was a trauma response, something that was familiar to him, something that he'd been used to for so long that he easily put up with it. Annette had violent mood swings. She was extremely jealous of other women, especially when it came to Fidel's exes, and Annette would cause a lot of drama. But for some reason, it seemed somewhat comforting to Fidel. As weird as that may sound, Annette was very manipulative. She would threaten to harm herself if she found out that he was with another woman. And oddly, to Fidel, this came off as endearing, as proof that Annette truly loved him, that she was willing to go to such great lengths, even take her own life. She loved him so much, she would lay down her life for him. And it gets weirder still. Besides the lying, control, and manipulation, Annette also practiced voodoo, and she would use her rituals to make Fidel submit to her. She dominated him and would make him drink her menstrual blood because she believed it helped her gain even more control of him. It was normal for Annette to fly into a jealous rage. She once even ran over one of his girlfriends with her car. She would violently claw at his face, leaving scratch marks behind, and his mother did the same things to men in her life. Fidel and Annette had trauma bonds, and she was in constant fear of losing him, especially when she found out that Fidel had a 1-year-old daughter by his former girlfriend, Trina. Annette was jealous of Trina's relationship with Fidel, which led to her having physical and verbal altercations with Trina from 1994 through 1995. Annette and Fidel got into the habit of getting physical with each other as well. In 1994, Annette made 2 complaints of domestic altercations against Fidel. She told police that he threw bricks at her, and he pushed her and had struck her in the face. And based on these allegations, Fidel was charged with criminal damage to property and domestic battery. Then in that January of 1995, Annette stabbed Fidel, and his lung was punctured. She said it was an accident. Despite Annette's criminal history and instances of violence, this woman was allowed to work as a certified nurse's aide. Wow. They really let that slip through the cracks. Tina also tells investigators that back in February, Annette claimed that she was pregnant and that she should have been due around August or September. At first, Annette's friends and family did not believe her because remember, she had a procedure many years ago and had been surgically sterilized, but not everyone knew that. But of course, Tina, being Annette's younger sister, she wanted to be there for her. And she actually did think it was possible that Annette could be pregnant, even though there were times in the past when Annette thought she was. But it either turned out she was lying or it was just a false alarm. But this time, Annette actually looked pregnant. Her face was swollen, her belly was protruding, according to Tina, and she was convinced that Annette was actually expecting a baby. And she even held a baby shower for her. All her friends and family came to celebrate, and a bunch of them bought her new items for the baby boy that she planned to name Fidel Jr. The thing is, Annette didn't end up having her baby in August or September, which seemed odd. That's when she started saying that her doctor miscalculated, and then they had the amniocentesis done, and they adjusted her due date to around October 14th. Investigators asked Tina if she knew who Annette's doctor was or which hospital she intended to deliver the baby, but Tina stated she had no idea. Now, I know that this sounds like a broken record, but October comes and still no baby. However, Annette still claimed that she was pregnant, and she was even hanging out with other pregnant friends like Patrice and Debbie, since they had that in common. Well, since investigators still have Patrice at the station, she and Dwight were brought over from Maywood PD to Addison. They want to know all about Annette's pregnancy, considering Patrice has admitted that Annette was one of her very close friends. Surely she would know if her BFF was really with child. But I'm sure you're putting 2 and 2 together. And so were the investigators. It's really suspicious that Annette was hanging out with 2 pregnant women, 2 that we know of. And Annette kept changing her supposed due date. I don't know if you remember this, but Patrice has a young child. She had just given birth like a month before Annette showed up on her doorstep with Joshua Evans in the middle of the night. Patrice had a newborn baby girl that would have been born very recently. You get what I'm trying to say here, right? So Patrice tells investigators that it's true. She and Annette were pregnant at the same time. And at first, Annette was interested in hanging out with Patrice and she was excited about the birth of her baby. But once Patrice told Annette that the ultrasound said that Patrice was going to have a girl, Annette was less excited and argued with her, saying that ultrasounds are not always correct and Annette may still have a boy. At this time, it probably sounded like Annette was just disappointed that they wouldn't both be boy moms. That's what you'd think. But it's way more sinister than that. When Patrice ended up having a girl, Annette didn't want anything to do with her or her baby anymore. Investigators asked Patrice, why do you think that is? And Patrice said that she thought it may have something to do with the fact that Fidel had a baby girl with his ex, and Annette did not hide the fact that she hated Fidel's ex Trina and the baby that they had together. Patrice said she recalled having a conversation with Annette where she said that Fidel's 1-year-old daughter was ugly and that the baby didn't look like Fidel at all because he was light-skinned. At that moment, Annette admitted she hated the baby because of how dark her skin was. She said it was too dark. So it struck everyone as very odd that she would make such a strong statement. But it started to make perfect sense when investigators began to connect the dots. It seemed as though Annette was only interested in a light-skinned baby, which was exactly what baby Elijah would look like, considering Debbie was white and James or Vern are black. Since we don't know who the father is, I'm just pointing out that they both have the same complexion. Well, once Patrice realized that her life and her baby's life could have been in danger by hanging around Annette, the truth begins to come out. There was way more to the story about what happened when Annette dropped Joshua off at her apartment. Patrice just hadn't come clean yet. The truth is a lot more gruesome, heartless, and terrifying than anyone could have imagined. It made my stomach turn when I read about it. When Josh was examined at the scene, he had visible ligature marks around his neck and at least 2 stab wounds to his throat. The investigators informed Patrice about Josh's injuries, and at the same time, they called the local police where Patrice's apartment is, and they requested that her 2 older daughters, who were 6 and 7, be picked up from school and taken to the station for their own protection. They had no idea what Annette and whoever else did this to Debbie's family were capable of, especially if they found out that Patrice and Dwight were talking. Investigators go back in and they speak with Tina now. They asked her whether she knew if her sister eventually gave birth to a baby. And shockingly, Tina says yes, she's actually seen the baby. Flabbergasted at this point, the investigators asked, well, when was this baby born? And that is when their hearts dropped into their stomach. Tina said that at 3:30 a.m. that very morning, Annette called Tina to tell her she'd just given birth to a baby boy and was now with Fidel and her friend Vicky Locolo. Vicky even got on the phone and repeated that Annette had just given birth. Tina asked Vicky to put Fidel on the phone. And when Fidel picked up, Tina asked, is there really a baby there? And he said, yes, of course. Well, Tina was excited, so she told her mother, and they quickly went over to Vicky's to see the baby and to be with Annette. When they arrived, Vicky explains that Annette had gone into labor while she was at Vicky's house, and she drove Annette to the hospital because the head of the baby had started to come out while Annette was there. Tina said that Annette explained Vicky gave her a shot of Demerol, which knocked her out, and when she woke up, she realized she delivered the baby. Afterward, Vicky gave her some Tylenol and codeine for the pain. But this contradicted what Vicky told Tina about them driving to the hospital to deliver. Nevertheless, the excitement of seeing the baby superseded any concerns they had about the story at the time. However, investigators asked Tina what Annette's other births were like. And Tina said that all of Annette's 3 prior children were delivered by cesarean. So it stands to reason she would have not had a vaginal birth, especially without a doctor being present. And she wouldn't already be home if she indeed went to a hospital. But then, Tina said when she saw the baby, he was dressed in a sleeper and a little hat, but she didn't think it was Annette's baby, and her mother didn't either. Tina explained that when Martha went over to see Annette's baby, she reached for him, but then she stopped and she looked at Annette and she says, "Whose baby is this really?" The baby was very pale. It even looked like it had some light hair peeking out from under its little hat. At that point, Vicky turned and stated, "Well, obviously Fidel's because it looks Cuban." And that's when Martha laughed at her and said, "Fidel is not Cuban. He's black. His other children are not light-skinned like this." So Annette also piped up and said all of her children were pale when they were born, but Annette's mom and sister were not convinced. After about 10 or 15 minutes, Tina and Martha left and they went home, and that's when Tina called hospitals to see if Annette had given birth, and she didn't find any record of that happening. So at this point, it's pretty clear what happened here. Annette has somehow gained possession of Debra's newborn son, Elijah, and she's trying to pass him off as her own. So it's imperative that they find Annette and quickly. Elijah could be in danger, especially because Tina told investigators that when she saw the baby, he was bleeding from his navel. That night around 8 o'clock, a judge signed a complaint against Jacqueline Williams, aka Annette, for aggravated kidnapping. The judge issued a warrant with a bond set at a whopping $1 million. But then about 30 minutes later, investigators receive a call from a corporal from the DuPage County Jail, and he's stating that he just got an anonymous phone call from a woman asking if Vern Ward was in custody. And when she was told no, she said the reason she was calling was because of the murder in Addison. She hung up without giving any more information. And then a second call came in. This time it was about 30 minutes later, around 8 p.m. The woman said a friend of Vern's told her that he had been arrested for the murders in Addison. And then she hung up again without identifying herself or providing any more context. And that is very interesting. We know that Vern is at the jail, but he had not yet been arrested. Investigators were still in the information gathering phase, but of course, he was a suspect. That night, Tina agreed to lead the detectives to Annette and Fidel's townhouse out in Schaumburg. It's around 10:45 when they arrive. They knock on the door, and one of Annette's daughters, the 11-year-old, answered, and she explained her mom and Fidel weren't home, that she was babysitting the other children. And when they asked where her mother was, she said she went to Wheaton with the baby. According to Annette's daughter, she left about an hour before this, and she doesn't know when she'll be back. Well, the investigators were prepared to wait because this is the closest they'd gotten to finding Elijah. Maywood detectives actually stayed inside the townhome, hoping to surprise Annette and Fidel upon their return. At the same time, Tina goes off with another team of detectives to locate this friend of Annette's named Vicky at her apartment in Wheaton. They also think this may be where Annette and Fidel were at. But they also need to question Vicky about her version of events. So back at the townhouse, Fidel and Annette return at 11:45 p.m. And when they walked up to the door, Annette was carrying a small newborn baby in an infant carrier. He was wearing baby pajamas, a white blanket with bears, an undershirt, white socks, a yellow baby blanket, and a disposable diaper. And officers noticed Fidel was wearing Debbie's boyfriend James's Grambling Tiger starter jacket, the one that James reported missing from their apartment on the night of the murders, and the right cuff is stained with what looks like blood. As soon as this couple passed the threshold of that front door, detectives moved in. They told both Annette and Fidel to stop where they were and hand over the baby. Annette hands the baby off to one of the detectives, who then moved upstairs to get away from what was transpiring between the couple and law enforcement. Both Annette and Fidel were put in handcuffs and moved to separate parts of the home. Fidel sat at the bottom of the stairs, and they moved Annette into the kitchen. The first question they had for Annette was whether the baby was hers, to which she replied, "Yes, I just gave birth." And then she stated the baby's name was Fidel Caffey Jr. She told them she even had a birth certificate, and she could show them where it was. Investigators saw the name on the birth certificate, Fidel Rashawn Williams Caffey. It said that he was born at Central DuPage Hospital at 8 p.m. on November 16, 1995, weighing 5.3 pounds, measuring 19 inches long, and that he was born to Jacqueline Annette Williams and Fidel Caffey. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So investigators asked permission to take a look around, and Annette said they could. They did not currently have a search warrant, so they could not do a thorough search, but they did a walkthrough, taking notes of areas of interest and items they wanted to either collect or examine. The baby was then transported to a nearby hospital to be evaluated, and both Annette and Fidel were taken into custody and brought to Addison Police Department to be interviewed. Meanwhile, a detective actually went to a judge's house at 2 a.m. to see if he would grant them a search warrant for both the townhouse and that Mercury Sable. That is due diligence, and this judge did approve both, so they wasted no time at all. They had the Sable towed, and they began their search of the residence where Annette and Fidel lived. Annette's children were taken to the station, and a relative was contacted. Later, Annette's mother, Martha, came to retrieve them. At 2:30 in the morning, Annette was being questioned, and of course, it seemed as though she had an explanation for everything. In summary, her first version is the one we kind of got from Tina and others. The baby was hers and Fidel's. She went into labor at Vicky's, but here's something that Annette didn't know and that you're just finding out as well. Patrice had been interviewed again after finding out more information and realizing that she may have been one of Annette's targets. So she came clean, and investigators already know what really happened and who was implicated. How they know is very disturbing. Before he was killed, Joshua told Patrice everything, and Patrice saw much more than she admitted during that initial talk with detectives. Wait until you hear what happened and what poor Joshua had to endure. It is pure evil. It starts out the same way I already told you, with Annette knocking on Patrice's window at 1 a.m. When she answered the door, Annette pointed towards the Sable that was parked out front and told Patrice that Fidel was waiting in the car with their new baby. That wasn't too much of a surprise to Patrice, since Annette had been saying she was pregnant for months. She let Annette inside with the little boy that she had never seen before. You already know what Annette told Patrice. She lied about Debbie being in a drug deal gone wrong. So she agreed to watch Josh overnight and assumed Annette was going to the hospital to be with his mother. At 6 a.m., Josh woke up screaming. He said his mother was dead, and Patrice is trying to comfort him, but he just wanted his mommy, who he still thought that he would somehow get to see, even though he said her eyes were closed, and so were his sisters, and that they were both dead. When Patrice asked who did this to Josh's family, he said he saw Vern, who he knew very well as his mom's ex-boyfriend and his brother's daddy. He also mentioned Annette and her boyfriend. He called him Adele or something like that, but he described him as Annette's boyfriend. And there was another man there, but he doesn't know his name, and he thinks it's Boo Boo. Dwight was listening in on some of this, so some of this actually coming from what Dwight told investigators during his second interview. When asked why the burglars didn't get to him, Josh said that he was hiding. But once they left, he ran outside, and that's when he saw Annette. He ran up behind her, and she took him with her, and that's how he got to Patrice's house. Little did Josh realize he was running into the arms of evil. He told Patrice that blood was everywhere on the walls and the floor of his apartment. He stated he was very scared and he was upset. This poor little boy. And the nightmare isn't even over. At 7:30 that morning, Patrice was getting her older daughters ready for school, and Josh was still crying. They tried reading a book to him to comfort him, but once the girls left, Josh hysterically begged for her to lock the door. Patrice at this point thought he was exaggerating, and she wasn't sure she believed his story. Well, Dwight made sure to tell investigators that Patrice is not very street smart, she's easily manipulated, and she trusted her friend Annette. She never met this little boy, so she wasn't sure. Annette finally showed up, and this time holding her newborn baby. Patrice let her in, and the first thing she said to Dwight and Patrice was, "Look at my new baby boy. Don't he look like Fidel?" And that's when Patrice was skeptical. So she confronted Annette with the story Josh told her. Annette then looked at Josh and said, "You don't know what the F you're talking about. Why you tell them that bullshit? You don't know what you're talking about. What's your problem? You talk too much." And Josh responded, "No, I'm not lying. You know you were there." And Annette told him to shut up and then to take his medicine. To which he replied, "What medicine?" Annette told him that his mom left him medicine for him in the car. She then dragged him into Patrice's kitchen, at which point she tried to make him swallow something that looked like Visine. Once it was down Josh's throat, he immediately ran to the bathroom and started vomiting. When she caught up to him, she tried to get him to drink iodine. This woman is disgusting. She's so evil and so vile. How could anyone do this to an innocent child? Well, Patrice, who's a mother, she couldn't believe what she was witnessing, but she's scared. She has no idea what Annette is capable of. She even agrees to go back to her place where she said she was going to give Patrice a gift and then stop at Walmart. Patrice wanted to make sure Josh was going to be okay, so she went along. Meanwhile, that's when Dwight saw the news of the double homicide and fetal abduction, and he's sitting there thinking, this sounds a lot like the story that little boy said happened. But then he sees pictures of the entire family. He said he saw a mother, a daughter, Josh, the little boy that stayed in his apartment, and a small black baby in the picture who police said was safe in their custody. So he was putting it all together. Annette brought Patrice, her newborn little girl, and the new baby and Josh back to her in Fidel's townhouse, where Patrice said she encountered another black male that she was not familiar with. Fidel called out to Annette, and the two of them were talking in the laundry room, yelling, actually. Then Annette called for Josh and Patrice. Annette was saying at this point that she had to get rid of Josh because he knew too much. He had to go. Patrice was like, "You can't do that." And Annette replied that she was on probation. It was between her going to jail or him, and he loses. At some point, they were joined by Fidel, and he was adamant they needed to get rid of Josh. Annette said, quote, "You don't understand, Patrice. I'll go to jail. That boy knows too much," end quote. Patrice asked them to let her take him with her. He just wanted his mother, and that they can't do this to him. Fidel explained that he told Annette to just drop Josh off in the projects, but she didn't listen because she thought he was going to get hurt. Well, he would have been better off. Annette told Josh to sit on the bed, which he did. He appeared to be scared, but he did exactly what he was told to do. Annette at this point appeared enraged, scared, and confused, and walked out of the room past Patrice. She went up the stairs to the kitchen area and returned with a knife. Patrice described the knife as having a brown handle approximately a foot long with rust on the blade. As she entered the room, Annette was holding this knife behind her back. Unreal. Patrice asked Annette, "What are you doing?" And she repeated that the boy knew too much, that he knew their names. Poor Josh was sitting on the bed with his back to Annette. Fidel told Patrice that she was going to be killed too if she opened her mouth. Patrice pleaded with them not to kill the boy. And for a minute, she thought they weren't going to do it after all. But then Annette picked up a white cord that was laying on the floor. Annette looked over at Josh and said, "I'm going to choke you. You talk too much." Little Josh was so scared. Then Annette told Josh to put his neck up to the cord while she was holding it out in front of her. He didn't want to, but he did as she asked. And I cannot believe that evil humans like this even exist. It made me so sick. Then Annette put the cord around his neck more than once. Fidel grabbed one side, and Annette pulled the other, and they began choking him. Patrice was yelling and screaming for them to please leave him alone. She said they will not talk, they'll never say anything, they won't tell anyone. But Fidel told her to shut up. And now Patrice was really scared for her life and her newborn baby. She started to scream really loud. Josh's face was turning blue at this point, and again, Patrice demanded them to let him go. At this point, they did stop pulling on the cord. But Annette turned to Patrice and once again said, "You don't understand. We have to get rid of him." At that point, Fidel told Annette they had to take Patrice home and get her out of here. Patrice thought that they were going to let Josh go with her, so she reassured him that everything was going to be okay, that they were going to go back to her house. But that's not what Annette and Fidel had in mind. Annette put her new baby in the car seat located in the passenger side back seat. Patrice got into the front seat of the passenger side with her baby on her lap. She turned around and she looked over her shoulder and she saw Fidel opening the rear driver's side door. At this point, Annette, Fidel, and Josh were by the open door. She doesn't know who, but someone was holding Josh's arms by his side. And then she saw Fidel holding a knife. She said it was the same knife Annette got from the kitchen earlier. Josh was then put into the rear driver's side back seat at approximately the same time that she saw Fidel move the knife in a stabbing motion towards Josh. Patrice screamed, and she saw Josh's head drop forward onto his chest. After Fidel stabbed Josh, she could see him put the knife and cord into a green garbage bag that already contained some garbage. The items were left in that garage. Patrice didn't think Josh was dead, though, because she could hear him crying and gurgling. She wanted to check on him, but Fidel would not let her. Fidel said they had to take him somewhere and drop him off. Fidel got in the back seat between Josh and the baby's car seat, and they drove into Maywood. They stopped in an alleyway, and both Annette and Fidel got out, and they supported Josh on both sides as he walked through a gate and out of sight. We know he was found dead in that alley. Fidel and Annette got back in the car. Annette dropped Fidel off somewhere and then took Patrice back home. On that drive, she recalled that Fidel threw a bloody bedsheet out the window that had been on the back seat where Josh had been sitting. When Patrice arrived back home, Dwight was there, and she did not tell him what happened. But as soon as she got in the door, Dwight was yelling that the boy's story was true and that he just saw him on the news. Patrice was in a panic because Annette was still there. She was out at the car getting her baby. And then she was walking up in that moment, and she could hear what Dwight was saying. But she didn't make a comment. Instead, she asked him if he had anything to clean up vomit from her car. But we know it wasn't vomit. It was blood and probably other bodily fluids all over the back seat and the floor where Josh had been sitting. Patrice went to the closet, took out some scrub brushes and Ajax, and gave them to Annette, who left their building and went back out to her car. When they were alone again, Dwight started to talk to Patrice, and they were both afraid of what they were involved in. At first, since Patrice had not seen the news, she wasn't sure that she could believe Dwight or what Josh had said until the midday news came on in that moment, showing Joshua's picture and indicating that his family had been killed in their Addison apartment, at which point Patrice became hysterical. They were both afraid that Annette and the people who did this were going to try to pin the crime on them or worse. After all, Josh had been at their house. His hair, his DNA, even his vomit was present. And that is when Dwight left to call 911. Josh may have been alive the last time Patrice saw him, but he definitely wasn't by the time she showed police where she saw Annette and Fidel drop him off. I wanted to tell you what his autopsy report stated, his cause of death, and the extent of his injuries. Dr. Lawrence Joseph Kogan conducted the examination. First, it was obvious from the ligature marks on the neck that he had been strangled, and that something was wrapped more than one time around the neck. There were also several stab wounds to Josh's neck and left lung, likely caused by a butcher knife. Dr. Kogan found that Josh's left lung collapsed from the stab wounds while he was still alive. He had an aspirated right lung, which showed that he had inhaled his own vomit after ingesting iodine. Josh had no defensive wounds, which meant he would have been restrained when he was stabbed. Dr. Kogan concluded that Josh would not have died instantaneously from his injuries, that he would have lived for more than 30 minutes. This little boy suffered, which is so extremely sad. In Dr. Kogan's opinion, Josh died from multiple injuries, strangulation, stab wounds, and the aspiration of his stomach contents. Telling Debbie's family that yet another one of their loved ones has been killed was not easy to hear. Sam could not believe that he was going to have to get 3 caskets for the funeral. It was truly heartbreaking. But hearing that the baby that they believed to be Elijah was safe and was at the hospital was the best news they could have gotten. Sam almost thought he was going to have to purchase 4 caskets, and he didn't know if he could handle any more bad news. But still, no one had officially been arrested yet. At this point, they have 3 of the people that Josh mentioned were present when his mother and sister had been killed: Annette, Fidel, and Vern. I do want to give you an update on the newborn baby, who was most definitely Elijah. He was found to weigh a healthy 6 pounds and 8 ounces. His umbilical cord appeared to have been cut closely to his stomach, and a slight infection had started to form. Otherwise, he was in good physical condition, thankfully. The outcome could have been a lot different. They were now waiting for DNA analysis to come back so they could find out who Elijah's parents really were, especially when it came to his father. Back at Annette and Fidel's townhouse, a complete search was being conducted. The first thing I want to point out is that this house was full of baby stuff. It was exactly what you would expect to see at the home of newly expectant parents, from strollers, baby carriers, cribs, and bottles everywhere. We know from Annette's sister Tina that they threw a baby shower for Annette not too long ago. So a lot of these items were most likely gifted to her in anticipation of a new baby that they thought she would have. Debbie's house wasn't full of so much new stuff for a newborn, but that's probably because she had a 22-month-old baby Jordan. She probably had a bunch of hand-me-downs already ready to go. But let me tell you the significant things that were found during the search. In the garage, investigators located a trash bag with a Visine bottle and a white cable with blood on it. In the dishwasher, which had already been run, investigators found a rusty, wooden-handled 13-inch butcher knife. There were also 2 birth certificates found, and it was obvious that both of them were fake. In the primary bedroom closet, investigators located a baby lotion bottle with a bloodstain on it. They also found a bunch of new baby items like formula, disposable bottles, a baby starter set, and wipes with diapers. And they all looked like they had just been purchased since there was evidence of receipts and plastic bags nearby. Investigators also found a sheet and a pillowcase in that townhouse, which matched the bed sheet that was stained with blood found just 7 blocks from where Joshua's body was recovered in Maywood. Now onto the vehicle. I actually have an evidence photo of this, but on the carpet of the backseat floor, Fidel and Annette's car had what appeared to be blood stains that had been treated with a cleaner of some kind. Swabs were taken of everything that appeared to have blood on it and sent to the lab. The evidence that had been collected previously from Debbie's apartment was also sent off for testing. They'd have to wait to hear about the DNA results. Back with Annette in the interview room, investigators stopped her before she could get deep into her version of events. They explained, "We already spoke to Patrice and Dwight. We know the truth. We know that you, Fidel, and Vern are involved in this now triple homicide." Annette immediately told detectives that it was her boyfriend Fidel that murdered Josh. Then she went into gory detail of the entire situation, blaming it all on Fidel, saying he told her to grab the knife. He told her they needed to kill Josh. He told her to drive, and he was the one who stabbed Josh. But she fails to mention the cord around his neck, and she lied about where the knife was. She said Fidel threw it out a car window. Of course, she would say that someone else did all of this, and that even applied to what happened to Debbie as well. In Annette's version, she said that she drove with Fern and Fidel over to Debbie's apartment, but she had no clue why they were going there. She waited in the parking lot, and when they came back, Fidel was carrying a baby, and that's all she was told. Her man had his own version of events. All these people did. They were all liars. When they interviewed Fidel, he claimed he had nothing to do with anything. First, he was wearing that jacket. Remember the one that I talked about? And he said it was given to him by a friend, Vicky. They asked Fidel to explain what appeared to be a bloodstain on one of the sleeves, and he said, I don't know where it came from. Then they asked him how he and Annette came into possession of the newborn baby. And he had an answer for that too. He said he was home all night on the 16th. He was actually watching Annette's 3 kids. Then he said at approximately 2:30 a.m. on Friday, Vicky rang the doorbell at the townhouse. He went to the door and Vicky told him to come outside. He immediately comes out and is handed a baby. And Vicky says, "Surprise, Fidel Jr." He, the baby, and Annette and Vicky all go inside the house. Fidel tells investigators that Annette told him she went into labor while she was walking down the stairs at Vicky's apartment. But Fidel admits that he didn't think Annette was big enough to be pregnant this whole time, even though she insisted she was. Plus, her due date kept changing. Fidel was confused, so he asked Annette, "Did you have any labor pains or anything?" And she said, "No, it just happened so fast." So the detectives asked Fidel if he wanted Annette to be pregnant. And he said yes. He said he wanted a baby boy who resembled him. And he was hoping Annette was telling him the truth. When asked about Josh and Samantha, the investigators showed Fidel pictures, and he stated he had never seen them in his entire life. And he'd never been to Debbie's house. He even acted like he hadn't seen the Mercury Sable until the evening of the 17th, which would have been after Josh was killed. Pretty convenient. Well, investigators also talked to Vicky. I was so curious to know what her version of events would be. Vicky stated that Annette's baby was not born in her house, that she did not give Annette any Tylenol or a shot to knock her out. Vicky said that Annette actually called her collect on the night of the 16th between 11:15 p.m. at midnight to say that she had a baby at the Cook County Hospital at 8 p.m. Annette told Vicky that she had to drop off her nephew, we know this is Josh, but that then she was going to come to Vicky's to show her the new baby. Vicky said that approximately 1 hour later, Annette showed up with the baby, and Vicky noticed that the baby's belly button was bleeding, so she gave Annette some gauze and tape to treat it. Vicky was then asked if she gave Fidel that jacket, and she said, actually, Annette gave Vicky the jacket and told her to present it to Fidel the next day and tell him it was a new father's present. This woman is so evil. Vicky says she was home all night and that her phone records would show that. She admitted she did give Annette some advice on how to create a fake birth certificate. And she even gave her laminate pages for that birth certificate. Annette told Vicky the reason she needed a birth certificate was because she didn't have one, because she went into the hospital under a false name because of welfare reasons. I know this is a lot, but following that interview with Vicky, Annette was re-interviewed. Annette was then confronted with all of the inconsistencies, at which point she changed her story, and she admitted that she knew Vern and Fidel were going to Debbie's apartment that night in Addison and that there was going to be some type of trouble. She claimed that Fidel told her to meet him there around 10 p.m. on the 16th. Annette did, and she said she brought Vicky with her, and they waited in the parking lot while Fidel and Vern were at Debbie's. Annette said Fidel comes running out of Debbie's apartment holding a baby. He gave the baby to Annette and said Debbie got shot and went into labor. Next, Annette said she saw Vern running out of the building. And then later, Josh came running out too. Annette said that she, Fidel, Vern, Josh, Vicky all left the area in the Sable. And while in the car, Josh told Annette that Fidel and Vern were robbers. Annette asked Fidel what is going on, and he said, Debbie got shot. This woman was still acting like she didn't just pretend she was pregnant for months to pull off this entire scheme. But she wasn't fooling anyone. I want to warn any expectant mothers to please be careful. You may not think this could happen to you, but pregnant women are targets. I know that it's so easy to share everything online. It's an exciting time. You're having a new baby, but please beware and protect your information, especially when it comes to strangers. People with these evil schemes in mind will come up in random places and pretend they're just interested in you and when you're due, or how far along you are. I can't tell you how many times I remember somebody doing that to me when I was pregnant with my daughter. I know it seems like they're just being kind, but you can never be too careful, and you don't have to share. Also, please be careful who you meet up with when you're pregnant. There are cases where women have pretended to sell baby clothes and used items just to get close to pregnant women and target them. Have your partner go or a friend if you really need to buy something off of, let's say, Facebook Marketplace or somewhere similar. Just be careful how much information you share and, sadly, who you get close to. So back to Annette. She told her story and it didn't make any sense. They already confirmed the child was not hers. It turns out the DNA test proved the baby was Debra's and Vern's. So it was Vern's, not James's. I was actually very surprised. But Annette began to cry. That's when she said, "I'm so sorry that any of this happened." And then she said she was finally ready to tell the truth. She wrote a 7-page confession, and still, this was not the whole truth. For the past 2 days, investigators had interviewed a number of people. I think I read at least 10 different interviews, and they poked all kinds of holes in all of the stories of these 3 suspects. Even family members weren't able to account for certain timeframes that each of these people swore to. Vern's roommate actually recanted portions of his story, and he said that he'd been lying about being with Vern the whole evening of November 16th. He said he had not seen him after 10 p.m. that night. There were also family members that saw Vern, Fidel, and Annette around 10 p.m. that night, and they picked Vern up at his aunt's house with a third person that is yet to be identified. Fidel was then confronted with all his inconsistencies, and he was told that Annette confessed. After he was allowed to read her entire confession, he was again asked about his involvement in the murders, and he said, "What can I say?" and went on to claim that he was with Annette's children the night of the 16th, so he couldn't have been involved. Police didn't believe Fidel, and he was taken into a cell until they got enough information for an official arrest. Meanwhile, Vern was also approached by investigators, and they told him they could not corroborate his whereabouts on November 16th. And they even played audio recordings from statements from witnesses. But he just called all of them liars. Vern continued to deny any involvement and kept saying he didn't kill anyone. Police asked Vern if it was possible that maybe he had just been present for the murders but not directly involved. But Vern continued to deny any and all involvement, even when they encouraged him that this might be the best opportunity to share any information he may have. The police then left the room and compiled multiple inconsistencies against Vern before returning and giving him one last time to share his side of the story. But again, he denied involvement. Vern and Fidel were later transported to jail. And on the way there, these men mentioned that they were going to get off on these charges just like OJ. Yeah, they were quite ballsy.
They gonna check our alibis. They framing us.
Fidel, Annette, and Vern were jointly charged with first-degree murder of Debbie, Samantha, and Josh, and the aggravated kidnapping of Josh and Elijah. They faced the death penalty and would ultimately be tried separately. The investigation was still going on. They wanted to make sure they had ample evidence so they could get justice for this family. Police spoke to Debbie's boyfriend, James, again. He stated that during the last few weeks before the murders, Vern called Debbie's apartment a number of times, and James overheard Debbie arguing with him over whether the baby she was pregnant with was him or James's. James further said that 1 week before the murders, Annette came to the apartment unexpectedly. When James opened the door, Annette told him that she was supposed to meet with Debbie. Well, James told her that Debbie was not home, and at this time, he knew nothing about Debbie meeting with Annette that day. Annette said, well, Debbie knows about it. And then she started to ask James things like when he went to work, when he got off of work, and James thought these were very unusual questions, but he answered them anyway. He stated that he worked from about 6 p.m. to 2:30 in the morning. James later spoke with Debbie about this encounter, and she told him she knew nothing about meeting Annette and that the whole situation did not sound right. Debbie then told James that just the day before, Annette had been asking Josh and Samantha questions when they were outside on their way to school, but James said that he did not know what these questions were about. Police asked James about how the murderers could have gotten inside the apartment, and he explained that because Debbie was 9 months pregnant, it was really hard for her to get around, so she would often let the kids leave a rock inside the apartment complex main door so they could come in and out of the building without having to get buzzed in. Wasn't a good idea. The other thing is, Vern knew that a rock was kept in the store and that Debbie didn't make the kids lock the apartment doors until she got ready for bed. James said that since he found Debbie still fully dressed, it was very probable that rock had still been in the front door and the doors to their apartment were probably unlocked when the perpetrators entered. Finally, the DNA results were back in, and the bloody fingerprint on the piece of paper addressed to Debbie on her hutch belonged to Annette. The blood on the bathroom vanity was Elijah's, and the blood on the poultry shears belonged to Samantha. Notably, investigators did not find any fingerprints or DNA belonging to Fidel or Vern in Debbie's apartment. That white cable with blood on it, it was Josh's. The blood in the backseat of Fidel and Annette's car was also Josh's. The blood on the baby lotion bottle found in the townhouse was both Josh's and Elijah's. And investigators learned that Fidel and Annette purchased a bunch of baby items at a few stores between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. This was sometime after Debbie was killed. Josh's blood was also on that bed sheet that they found blocks away from where his body was found in the alley. An empty iodine bottle was found in the garbage at Patrice's house, and we know that Annette used this on Joshua. The 2 birth certificates found in the townhouse were tested, and both of them were counterfeit. Oh, and remember that blood-soaked ace bandage that was found at Debbie's? Well, a witness had seen Annette wearing an ace bandage on her right arm a few days before the murders. There were a number of people who were interviewed about Annette claiming she was pregnant. She went so far as to, one, of course, fool her own children, which is just sad because they were all excited for a new baby brother. But 2, she also used the new baby as an excuse all the time. For example, throughout October when the girls were late or they couldn't make it to school for some reason, Annette would say she was having the baby. But then she would claim it was false labor. And she did this again just days before the murders. But then it changed to she had the baby, and that's why the children were absent. 1 week before the murder, Annette Williams came into the school in the morning with both of her daughters. She was in the principal's office. Someone working at the school asked Annette, "How's the baby doing?" She said, "Fine." Okay, mind you, no baby. Then Annette was asked, "Do you have any pictures?" And she said, "Oh, not yet." Annette was standing there with both of her daughters when a school employee turned to them and said, "Who helps mommy more with the baby?" And they both responded that they each helped. That's sad. It's sad that these girls are either confused or somehow Annette convinced them to lie for her. Even before all of this, Annette's probation officer, Darlene, said that on November 1st, Annette told her over the phone that she had given birth. Then at an appointment on the 9th, Annette said she named the baby Elijah. Elijah, can you even wrap your brain around this? Darlene asked Annette to bring proof that she had a baby, but she never did. Wow. So she even tried to pass Debbie's baby off with its real name. And what about this? Police also spoke to a woman named Cassandra, who said that on November 16th, between 5:30 and 6 p.m., she got a call from Fidel, and he told her that he and Annette were gonna have their baby that day, but they, quote, have to go do something first, end quote. I wonder what that was that they needed to do. Cassandra told Fidel to call her and let her know when the baby came. And on November 17th, a friend of Cassandra's informed her that Annette had the baby. So Cassandra actually paged Annette. Fidel called her back saying that they had a baby boy. But here's where things really came together. Police also spoke to Dawn, a neighbor of Fidel and Annette's. And I promise I'm wrapping this in a big, nice bow for you so you understand how crazy the story is. Dawn said that in May of 1995, She went to Fidel and Annette's to just borrow their vacuum cleaner. And when she was inside, Vicky was there, along with a few other people. And Vern came in yelling and screaming that Debbie wasn't allowing him to see Jordan. We know James mentioned in the months leading up to the murder that Vern would call and fight with Debbie over Jordan. Well, Dawn said that Vern was yelling and that he was tired of Debbie's shit and he wanted to, quote, kill the bitch, end quote. Vern then punched a hole in the wall between the living room and the kitchen, and Annette called for Fidel to come downstairs. Fidel then asked Vern if he wanted a gun or a knife, and Annette told Vern to calm down because he would be the most likely suspect if Debbie was killed. Dawn told police that Fidel, Annette, and Vern moved to another room, and Dawn heard someone talk about a baby and whether they still wanted the baby. A man who had been sitting on the couch was then called into the room, and he called out for Vicky to join them. And that's when Dawn heard that man and Vicky say that they still wanted the baby and they had the money. Wow. So it seemed like there was even a plan somewhere in the beginning to sell this poor baby. Dawn told police that she did not actually think Fidel was serious when he asked Vern whether he wanted a gun or a knife. Dawn explained that she remembered exactly what was said because she argued with her husband about it. And ultimately, they decided they did not want Fidel coming by their house anymore because they were capable of killing somebody. But there's more. In late November, a concerned citizen called the police and said that Vicky bought a gun from a guy named Ron. Vicky then loaned the gun to Annette a few days before the murders. And after the murders, Annette supposedly gave the gun back to Vicky, who then returned it to Ron to throw it in the river. Of course, police confronted Vicky about her not being truthful. She stated she was being entirely truthful. However, she did not want to tell them about the gun because she was worried they would charge her with murder. Vicky said she knew where the gun was, but she wanted to speak with the assistant state attorney before she told them. So police got the assistant state attorney on the phone, and he spoke to Vicky for a short time. Then she proceeded to lead police to the gun, which was in a lake in the area of Route 56, Butterfield Road, and Hendrick Road. Vicky said that Annette asked her to get a gun for her and Fidel so that they could go buy a kilo of cocaine, and they just needed it for protection. Vicky actually just told Annette to go to the gun supply store. However, Annette told Vicky she had a police record, so she couldn't get a gun. Vicky admitted she did get the gun from a friend, Ron, 2 weeks before the murders, and then she sold that gun to Annette on the day of the murders. They end up finding this gun, and when they do, they ask Vicky if she was the one who threw the gun out of the car, and I hate that there's yet another person, but she said no, it was her friend, Dorothy. Vicky was the one driving, and Dorothy threw the gun. Following Vicky's interview and finding the gun, they interviewed Ron, they interviewed Dorothy, and they later determined that the gun they found fired the bullet that was recovered from Debbie's head. It was a .25 caliber pistol. Vicky, Dorothy, and Ron were all charged with obstruction of justice. Wow, there were so many people involved in this. And police continued investigating the murders. They spoke to Patrice and Dwight again, who said that in the summer and fall of 1995, Annette also asked them on multiple occasions to get her a gun, and they always said no. Police continued to try to identify the other black man that Patrice had seen at Fidel and Annette's that night, but they showed Patrice a photo array. She began to cry. She looked at one photo, and she said she thought it was the man she saw. She was too scared to be 100%. And Patrice eventually told the police this man was Calvin Bo Wilson. And she was fairly positive that it was Bo at the townhouse when she, Annette, and Josh arrived. He was never actually able to be 100% identified, but it does make sense. Josh said there was another person there by the nickname Boo Boo. Maybe he meant Bo or Bobo. After little Elijah was released from the hospital, Debbie's father, Sam, took custody of both him and Jordan. And get this, when 22-month-old Jordan was with Debbie's sister Wendy after the murders, he began talking to her. And here's what's wild. This little boy could speak very well. He just never talked to strangers. He revealed everything he saw to Wendy. He told her exactly what happened and who was there. He even knew people's names. Wendy called the police, told them that Jordan saw the whole thing and that they needed to come talk to him. So they did talk to him and they were able to verify this information. Guess what? The killers thought with Debra, Samantha, and Josh out of the way, they got rid of all the witnesses. But they were wrong. Baby Jordan could talk, and they didn't know that. So Debbie's dad said, you better believe they would have butchered him as well had they known. Annette Williams was the first defendant to go to trial. The prosecution laid out all the evidence they compiled so far, telling the jury that Annette was never pregnant in 1995. Instead, she faked her pregnancy and Fidel went along with it. By the fall of 1995, they really wanted a baby boy that resembled Fidel, so they conspired with Vern to kill Debbie, steal her unborn child, and pass it off as Annette and Fidel's. The prosecution contended that Vern wanted Debbie dead because he was angry at her for preventing him from seeing his son Jordan. The defense admitted that Annette was present for the murders. However, they claimed Annette did not kill anyone. They said Annette had a twisted dependence on Fidel and thought she could keep him only by giving him a child. That's why she went along with his and Vern's plan to kill Debbie and steal her baby. But you see, let's not forget that Annette was a nurse's aide, and through her training, it included the study of how a C-section is conducted. We know it usually takes more than one person to carry it out. She said she only helped with the baby after it was removed from Debbie's womb, that she blew into his mouth to make sure he was breathing. But I think we know that she did much more than that. Annette did not testify in her own defense, which was probably a good move on her part. But in the end, it didn't matter because the jury found Annette guilty of all charges. Following the verdict, Debbie's family was happy. Her sister Wendy said, "We lost 3 members of our family and we will never get them back. How can you expect us not to be overwhelmed by excitement and grief?" Debbie's brother Sam Jr. added that he wanted to wish Josh a happy birthday. He would have turned 10 the following day. Next up, the jury had to determine if Annette would receive life in prison or the death penalty. They decided death, which the judge later formally sentenced her to. Vern Ward's trial was next. The prosecution's case was very similar to the one they presented at Annette's trial. However, they weren't allowed to tell the jury about Annette's confession implicating Vern. Instead, they had to rely on Patrice's testimony about how Josh named Vern as one of his mom's and sister's killers. The prosecution argued that Vern wanted Debbie dead because, as I said, she wouldn't give him access to his son Jordan. And even if evidence can't place him at the scene of the crime, people couldn't account for his whereabouts on that night, and he should still be held accountable because he knew what was going to happen. Vern's defense was that he was in no way, shape, or form involved in these murders. They said there was no physical evidence tying Vern to any of these crimes, and he had an alibi. He was at his friend's, his own home, and his family's on the night of the murders. Vern did take the stand in his own defense, denying that he had anything to do with the murders.
And if you don't want to believe me, all you have to do is look at their police reports. It'll tell you better than I can. All I'm asking is someone to please look at the facts.
He called all the prosecution witnesses liars and spent a lot of his testimony explaining away the things that they said. The jury did not believe Vern's story, and they found him guilty on all counts. And the jury decided that he should also get the death penalty. Debbie's family said they thought Vern deserved it. It wouldn't bring Debbie, Josh, or Samantha back. But Debbie's mother said every time she thought of them, she saw a picture of them or she heard somebody say their names, she thought of the murderers and what those last few minutes of her loved one's life was like. In the end, the jury declined to give Vern the death penalty, citing a lack of physical evidence. He was given life in prison plus 60 years. Up last was Fidel's trial. The prosecution's case was very similar to what we already heard in the previous trials. Fidel's defense told the jury he wasn't involved in any of the murders. It was Annette and Vern and possibly Vicky. The defense said Annette was possessive of Fidel, and she planned to cement their relationship by claiming to be pregnant with his child. Annette then conspired with Vern and Vicky to steal Elijah and to present him to Fidel as his own. The defense said those 3 committed the murders. Fidel had no idea about it. The defense wanted to tell the jury about Vicky's statements to the police, but the judge excluded them. The state would later say that they seriously considered charging Vicky in connection with the murders as well, but ultimately they determined they could not actually place her at the murder scene. Fidel also testified on his own behalf, stating that Annette told him she was pregnant in February 1995 and that her due date was in August. Fidel explained that at that time, he did not know that Annette could not have children. And when the baby kept not coming, he told her he didn't want to hear about her being pregnant anymore. Fidel explained to the jury that he did not want to have a child with Annette because he didn't even want the relationship to go very far. The jury once again did not believe Fidel's story, and he was found guilty on all counts. Debbie's dad, Sam, said the family was very happy with the verdict. He could now tell his grandsons that the last bad man was going to prison. Next, the jury had to decide if Fidel should receive the death penalty, and they agreed he should. And the judge sentenced Fidel to death. Following this, Debbie's sister Wendy said justice had been served, but it wasn't over for this poor family and never would be. Their lives were destroyed forever. But then, in 2003, Debbie's family got some very unfortunate news. Illinois Governor George Ryan commuted all death row sentences to life without parole. That meant that Fidel and Annette would no longer face death. Instead, they would spend the rest of their life in prison just like Vern. And today, all three of them remain behind bars. This was definitely a devastating blow to Debbie's loved ones. Her mother, Jackie, said, quote, "It's not closure. You can't give me closure, not in this life. They deserve to die. George Ryan played God," end quote. Jackie has been interviewed a number of times, and she's talked about how shocking it was to see how much blood can come from a child's body, referring to the crime scene photos that she had to see, and that she has been only able to get through this because of antidepressants, and now she will never understand what was going through the killer's minds. Jackie's comfort comes from photos, so she can remember her daughter and her grandchildren the way they were before. She said she can't even watch TV anymore. I didn't even think of that, but she explained that even hospital shows with sick, suffering children have become unbearable. Debbie's father, Sam, who raised both Jordan and Elijah, said that they were both nervous and confused about the death penalties being overturned. He said, quote, "I've been telling them the killers are in prison and will be killed for what they did. And now they're asking me if they'll get out," end quote. In December 2011, Elijah, who goes by Eli, was 16 years old, and he spoke to the media for the first time. He talked about how he and Jordan shared a passion for football. They played on the varsity football team, Eli wearing number 43 and Jordan wearing 34. Eli said the first time the brothers were apart was in the fall of 2011. Jordan, who was now a senior, moved to Kentucky to live with his uncle. The move was so that Jordan could play football for a bigger high school, increasing his chances of being recruited. Eli mentioned that being separated from Jordan was really tough, but to make it more bearable, they spoke on the phone every single night. Eli shared that he tries not to think about the violence surrounding his birth. Instead, he talks to his grandpa about his mom. He said, quote, "I like to learn more new stuff about her from my grandpa. Every day he tells me, you're looking more and more like your mom. And I'll just smile and ask questions about her. She lives on through us," end quote. He also mentioned sometimes it gets too much for him and he has to walk away and cry by himself.
I'll usually look up stuff or something like that just to remind myself what really did happen, reading through it. And sometimes it just gets a little gruesome.
I am not a hero. I'm just a grandpa who loved his, dad who loved his daughter and a grandpa who loves his grandkids.
Ultimately, as much as Sam says that he wants to hate these evil people for what they did, he doesn't want to teach hate to the boys. He believes in justice, and in his heart, he forgives them. And he teaches Jordan and Elijah to have compassion and love instead of hate. And it seems like he's doing a great job raising those boys. I hope that they've continued to thrive. And I'm so sorry to Debbie's family for what she went through, and all of her children as well. This has been a long story, but I felt like it needed to be told so that we're aware of the evil that exists in our world, in our own friend group sometimes, or even our families. It's so horrible to think that this really did happen. And there are so many other cases just like it. So be careful, be safe, And thank you all for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye.